The last week of October came to Barrow Creek the way bad news always did, quietly, without warning, and with the kind of cold that settled into your bones before you even realized the temperature had dropped. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline each morning, the ranch hands at Barrow Creek were already out in the corrals, their breath rising in thin white clouds above their shoulders. The cottonwood trees along the creek had gone mostly bare, their yellow leaves buried under a thin crust of frost that crunched underfoot until mid-morning when the sun finally burned it off. The cattle moved slower in this kind of weather, so did the men. Clara Bennett had been at Barrow Creek Ranch for 11 months. She had come in the previous December on the recommendation of a woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who ran a boarding house in the town of Mineral Falls, 12 miles south. Mrs. Hartwell had written a letter to the ranch foreman, a stout, sun-weathered man named Douglas Pruitt, describing Clara as a capable and hard-working young woman who knew her way around a kitchen and wouldn't cause trouble. That last part, Clara suspected, was the sentence that had actually gotten her hired. She was 23 years old. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches. With dark brown hair she kept pinned back during working hours and wide-set gray eyes that her mother had always said looked like they were waiting for rain. She wasn't a remarkable-looking woman by the standards of the territory, and she had understood that about herself for long enough that it no longer stung. What she had, what she'd always had, was her usefulness. She could bake bread that didn't crumble, make stew from whatever was left in the cold cellar, keep a fire steady through a night that dropped to 15 degrees, and wake up before anyone else without being asked. These were not glamorous skills, but in a working ranch kitchen on the high Montana plains, they were the ones that mattered. The kitchen itself was a long, low-ceilinged room attached to the back of the main ranch house by a covered breezeway. It had a cast-iron stove large enough to heat the entire space, even on the coldest mornings, a long wooden work table that had been scarred and stained by decades of use, 2 deep stone sinks, and a row of iron hooks along one wall where Clara kept her pots and ladles in descending order of size. There was a single window above the left-hand sink, set low enough that she could look out at the yard while she worked. In the warmer months, she'd propped it open with a piece of kindling and let in the smell of grass and sage. Now she kept it mostly latched against the cold, opening it only when the steam from the stove made the room feel airless. She spent most of her waking hours in that kitchen. The hands ate in 2 shifts. The early crew at 6 in the morning, the later men at noon, and supper was served at the long table in the bunkhouse at sundown. Between meals, there was always bread to bake, beans to soak, lard to render, coffee to keep hot, and a dozen other small tasks that filled the hours she might otherwise have spent idle. She didn't mind the work. Work had a rhythm to it, a beginning and an end. It was the hours between supper and sleep, when the kitchen was hers alone and the only sound was the fire settling inside the stove, that she sometimes didn't know what to do with herself. That was when she sang. She'd never had lessons. Her mother had taught her a handful of old songs when Clara was small, the kind of ballads that had traveled west with the wagon trains and gotten worn smooth with use, their original words half forgotten and replaced by whatever each singer remembered best. Clara had added to them over the years, picking up fragments from other women she'd worked beside, from traveling musicians who came through towns where she'd lived, from the radio someone at a previous ranch had played on Sunday afternoons. The songs she sang weren't polished. They were stitched together from memory and improvisation, and she never sang the same version twice. She didn't sing for anyone. She sang because it was the only time she felt like the kitchen was hers in some way that went beyond cooking and scrubbing. When she sang, the low-ceilinged room felt less like a workplace and more like, she didn't have a better word for it than somewhere. Somewhere she could exist without being useful to anyone. On the last Thursday of October, she was alone in the kitchen after supper. The hands had eaten and gone back to the bunkhouse. Douglas Pruitt had come through around 7 to tell her the stovepipe in the far corner of the main house was drawing poorly and asked if she could send over a pot of hot coffee before she turned in. She'd done that, returned the pot, and come back to find the kitchen quiet and the fire burning low and steady. She was washing the last of the supper dishes, her hands deep in water that had already gone lukewarm, and she was singing, not loudly, not performing, just threading the words of an old ballad through the rhythm of the scrubbing without really thinking about it. The song was something her mother had sung about a river, and a woman waiting beside it, and a man who never came back, and Clara had changed the ending years ago to one where the woman just got up and walked away from the river on her own, which seemed more honest. She didn't hear the horse stop outside. Colton Ashford had been riding the southern boundary of his property since mid-afternoon. He did this every few weeks, not because it needed doing, not strictly. He had men whose job it was to check fences and count cattle, but because there were days when the inside of his own head became a place he didn't want to be, and the only remedy was to put a horse under him and ride until the open country cleared things out. He was 41 years old, and he'd been the largest landowner in the Montana Territory for the better part of a decade. And neither of those facts had made his head a quieter place to live. The Ashford spread covered just under 12,000 acres of grassland, timber, and creek-fed meadow in the middle of the territory, running from a chain of low hills in the west to the edge of the Barrow Creek drainage in the east. His main operation was cattle. He ran somewhere between 2,800 and 3,000 head, depending on the season. But he also maintained a horse operation on the northern end of the property and leased grazing rights on 2 additional sections east of the creek. He employed 43 men full-time and another dozen or more during branding and shipping season. His name appeared in the territorial papers regularly. He shook hands with governors. He had been asked twice to run for the territorial legislature and had declined both times without explanation. He was, by any reasonable measure, successful. He was also, by his own private assessment, thoroughly bored with most of it. That wasn't something he said aloud. It would have sounded ungrateful, which he wasn't. He understood well enough what it had taken to build what he had, and he wasn't foolish enough to pretend otherwise. But there was a difference between being grateful for something and finding it satisfying, and for several years now the gap between those two things had been widening in ways he wasn't sure how to address. He'd been engaged once, 7 years ago. A woman named Margaret Hollis, from a respectable Helena family. She had been sensible and well-spoken and had understood perfectly what being married to Colton Ashford would entail, and she had made her decision accordingly, which was to call off the engagement 2 months before the ceremony and marry a lawyer in Billings who came home at a predictable hour. Colton hadn't blamed her for it. He'd barely blamed her at the time. He'd just gotten back on his horse and gone back to work. And the years had accumulated since then in the particular way they do when you're busy enough not to notice them passing. He was riding back north along the east boundary when he passed the low-lying corrals and outbuildings of Barrow Creek Ranch, a neighboring property he knew casually. He'd done minor business with the family that had previously owned it, hay sales mostly, and he knew the current owner had changed hands twice in the past 4 years. He knew Pruitt managed the day-to-day operation. He didn't know much more than that. He was not thinking about Barrow Creek Ranch when he pulled his horse to a stop on the dirt track that ran parallel to the ranch's back fence line. He stopped because he heard something. It was a voice, a woman's voice, coming through a lit window set low in the building attached to the back of the main house. It wasn't loud. In fact, if the wind had been blowing differently, if his horse had been moving at a faster pace, he almost certainly would have missed it. But the evening was still, and his horse was walking, and the sound reached him clearly across the 50-odd feet of yard between the fence line and the kitchen window. She was singing. Colton Ashford sat on his horse in the dark at the edge of someone else's property and listened to a woman he had never seen sing a song he didn't know the words to. And something happened inside him that he would have had a very hard time naming if anyone had asked. It wasn't that the voice was extraordinary exactly. It wasn't a trained voice. There were rough edges to it, places where she reached for a note and came at it slightly crooked, places where the melody bent in ways that probably hadn't been in the original. But it was absolutely, utterly unguarded. There was no performance in it, no awareness of being heard. Whatever she was singing about, she meant it, and the meaning came through the unpolished edges more clearly than it would have through anything smoothed out and prettied up. He sat there for longer than he should have. He was aware of that, even at the time. When the singing stopped, when the sounds inside shifted back to the ordinary sounds of a kitchen being closed down for the night, he stayed another moment, then turned his horse and rode north. He didn't go home directly. He circled around to the east pasture, checked the water trough that one of his men had reported was leaking, found it had already been repaired, and rode home in the dark with nothing particular to show for the detour. That night, sitting at his desk in the study of the main house, he wrote a note. Not a long one. He wasn't a man who wrote long notes. He wrote, "I heard you singing through the window this evening. I don't know the song, but I know it was something real. The territory needs more of that." He didn't sign it. He folded it once, went out to the barn, saddled a horse in the dark, rode back to Barrow Creek Ranch, and left the folded note on the windowsill of the kitchen, propped against the frame where it would be seen in the morning. Then he rode home, unsaddled the horse himself because he didn't want to wake the stable hand, and went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. Clara found the note the next morning. She almost missed it. She came through the kitchen door with her arms full: apron, the flour sack she'd brought back from the cold storage, a bucket she needed to fill at the pump. And she didn't notice the folded paper against the window frame until she was setting things down on the work table. She picked it up and read it standing there in the early morning dark, before she'd even gotten the stove going. She read it twice. Then she set it on the corner of the work table and stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. Her first thought was that someone was making fun of her. The hands sometimes did that, not cruelly, mostly, but in the thoughtless way of men who've spent too long in close quarters and forget that other people's private things are private. She turned the note over, looking for something that would tell her it was a joke. There was nothing. The handwriting was careful and unhurried, written in ink, not pencil. She reread the last line. The territory needs more of that. She didn't know what to make of it. She folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron and started the stove and didn't think about it again until after the breakfast dishes were done and the mid-morning hours opened up around her. Then she thought about it a good deal. She didn't tell anyone. There was no one she would have told. 3 days later, she came to the kitchen in the dark of the early morning and found a cord of firewood stacked neatly against the north wall of the breezeway. It was dry wood, good dry oak, not green cottonwood, and it had been split to a size that would fit the kitchen stove without any additional cutting. The stack was taller than her head and would last well into December. She stood looking at it for a long time. She asked Douglas Pruitt if he'd arranged for it. He squinted at it like it offended him. "Not for my orders," he said. "We've got plenty of wood in the shed." "Then who—" "I'll look into it," he said, which meant he wouldn't. A week after that, she came in one morning to find that the loose hinge on the cold storage door, the one she'd been asking about for 2 months because it didn't latch properly and let the cold air leak, had been repaired. The new hinge was properly set. The door swung clean and closed with a solid click. She opened and closed it 3 times just to feel it. The week after that, someone left a tin of good tea on the windowsill. Not the cheap black tea the hands drank, but something with a faint sweetness to it that she didn't have a name for, in a tin with a painted label she didn't recognize. There was no note this time. There was no note with any of it. Clara began to suspect something was happening, but she couldn't have said exactly what, and she didn't know who to ask. November arrived with 3 days of snow that blocked the north road and kept the supply wagon from making its run. The ranch ran on its stores, which were adequate, and the hands spent the time they would have spent outdoors doing indoor repairs, mending harnesses, repainting the bunkhouse walls, fixing the busted slats on the corral fence as soon as the snow let up enough to work outside. Clara kept the stove burning and the coffee ready and produced meals out of the cold storage with the steady, methodical creativity of someone who had learned to cook under scarcity. The hands ate well, and more than one of them said so, and she accepted the compliments with the same measured nod she always used because she'd learned long ago that too much warmth in response to compliments invited the kind of familiarity that eventually caused problems. On the second day of the snowstorm, Colton Ashford rode into the yard at Barrow Creek. She saw him from the kitchen window. She didn't know who he was, not immediately. She registered a man on a tall bay horse, well-dressed in the way that suggested money without being showy about it, riding through the gate and pulling up near the main house. Pruitt came out to meet him, and they spoke for a few minutes with the particular body language of men who know each other but aren't close. The visitor tied his horse at the post and went inside the main house with Pruitt. An hour later, when she brought a pot of coffee and a plate of cornbread to the main house sitting room where Pruitt took his business meetings, she pushed open the door and found 2 men at the table with maps spread out between them. Pruitt looked up. "Miss Bennett, thank you. Set it there." He gestured to the corner of the table. She set the pot down. She was about to leave when the second man looked up from the maps. He was tall. She could tell that even seated. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had spent a lot of years outdoors and showed it in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. He had the kind of self-contained stillness to him that you sometimes saw in men who didn't need to prove anything to the room they were sitting in. Not cold exactly, just settled. "Thank you," he said. "Of course," she said, and left. She was halfway down the breezeway before she thought anything further about it. Then, slowly, it occurred to her that his voice had a particular quality to it. Low, deliberate, not unkind. She didn't know why she'd noticed it. She went back to the kitchen and started on the afternoon bread. "Chit," Pruitt told her at supper that evening when she brought his plate. "That was Colton Ashford out here today. Biggest landowner in the territory. He was looking at buying the back section if the owner's willing to negotiate. He said it the way he said most things, without any particular inflection, and moved his fork around his plate as if the information didn't warrant much attention." Clara said. "He's been in the territory 20 years, Pruitt added, which seemed like all he had to add on the subject. That night, alone in the kitchen after supper, she thought about the man at the table. The way he'd said thank you without looking back down at the maps first, which meant he'd actually paused to say it instead of fitting it around something else. It was a small thing, but she'd been serving plates and pouring coffee for men for long enough to know that the small things were usually the truest ones. She washed the dishes, she banked the stove fire for the night. She sang, quietly, one of the songs her mother had taught her. She didn't think about who might be able to hear it. The visits didn't stop. Colton Ashford returned to Barrow Creek twice in the following 3 weeks on business with Pruitt regarding the potential land purchase. Each time, Clara saw him from the kitchen window or crossed paths with him briefly in the main house. Each time, he was polite in the unhurried way she'd noticed the first day, not overly attentive, not dismissive, just present in a way that didn't demand anything from her. She still hadn't connected him to the note, or to the firewood, or to the repaired hinge. The connection came on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, when she was crossing the yard from the cold storage with a basket of potatoes, and she heard one of the younger hands, a boy named Ira, maybe 17, who had a habit of talking too much, saying to another hand near the corral gate, "Saw him fixing that hinge himself, week before last. Didn't say a word to nobody, just fixed it and rode off." Clara kept walking. She didn't stop. She didn't ask. But she put it together that evening, standing at the kitchen window with her hands in the dishwater, watching the early dark settle over the frozen yard. Colton Ashford, the richest man in the Montana Territory, had left her an anonymous note about her singing, had brought firewood, had fixed the cold storage door, had left tea on her windowsill. She stood there with her hands going cold in the dishwater and felt something she couldn't quite categorize. Not flattered, exactly, because flattery was something that happened in public, something performed. This was different. This had been private. He'd done it without wanting credit for it, without wanting her to know it was him, which meant he hadn't done it to impress her. He'd done it because something had made him want to. She didn't know what to do with that. She finished the dishes. She dried her hands. She stood at the window for a moment longer than she needed to. She did not sing that night. The following week, she was rolling out pie crust on the work table. It was early enough in the morning that the sun was barely up, and the kitchen was lit mostly by the stove and a single lamp on the shelf, when she heard boots on the breezeway boards and looked up to find Colton Ashford standing in the open kitchen doorway. He wasn't expected. He had both hands up in a gesture of harmlessness before she could say anything. "I'm sorry," he said. "Pruitt isn't here yet. I came early. I didn't mean to startle you." "You didn't startle me," she said, which was not completely true. He stayed in the doorway. He didn't come into the kitchen, which she registered. "Is there any coffee?" "There will be in 20 minutes. I can wait." He settled against the doorframe without apparent discomfort, the way a man does who's comfortable with silence. She went back to the pie crust. For a while, neither of them said anything. The stove ticked. Outside, one of the horses made a sound in the near pasture. "I know it was you," she said. She didn't look up from the dough. She heard him shift against the doorframe. "Know what was me?" he said. But his voice had changed. Not much, just a fraction, just enough that she could tell he knew exactly what she was talking about. "The note," she said, "the firewood, the hinge." She paused. "The tea." Another moment of quiet. "I wasn't trying to he started. "I know," she said. And then, because she felt she should, "Thank you." She finally looked up. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between cautious and something else. something she didn't have a name for. "The tea was from a merchant in Helena," he said. "I didn't know if you'd like it." "It was good," she said. "I stretched it for 2 weeks." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. More like something relaxing that had been held tight. "Glad to hear it," he said. The coffee took 20 minutes. They didn't talk much during the wait. She worked on the pie crust. He stood in the doorway and watched the yard come to life as the hands started their morning. But the silence had a different quality to it than she'd have expected. It wasn't awkward. It was just quiet. When she poured his coffee, she handed it across the work table rather than setting it on the corner. He took the cup and their fingers didn't touch, and she went back to her work. He drank the coffee standing in the doorway. He thanked her when he finished and left to find Pruitt. That evening, alone in the kitchen, Clara stood at the window for a long time before she started the dishes. And then, slowly, quietly, she began to sing. She didn't think anyone could hear her. She was wrong. What Ira, the 17-year-old hand, reported to 2 of the other men that night, not maliciously, just because Ira had the unfortunate habit of narrating everything he witnessed, was that he'd seen Colton Ashford's horse tied at the fence post along the east side of the property for nearly an hour after the man himself had left the main house, and that when Ira had gone to check on it, he'd found nobody there, just the horse tied patient and still, until finally Ashford had appeared from the direction of the breezeway and untied it and ridden north without a word of explanation. Ira told this story twice. The second time, the man he was telling it to, an older hand named Cal, who had been on the property longer than Pruitt, listened without expression and then said, "Boy, you didn't see anything." "I saw—" "You didn't see anything," Cal said, and went back to his cards. Ira dropped it, but Cal sat with it for a while after, tapping his cards on the table without playing them. In 23 years of working ranches in the Montana Territory, he had seen rich men notice women who worked for them about 100 different times. And he had never once seen it go the way it should have. Not once. He dealt himself another hand and thought about it, and couldn't figure out a reason this time would be different. December settled in. The land went gray and white, and the creek froze over in the shallow places. The cattle huddled in the south pastures where the tree line broke the worst of the wind. Clara kept the kitchen warm and the hands fed and the coffee hot, and she watched the calendar with the particular attention of someone who has learned that the calendar is the most reliable thing going. Colton Ashford came to Barrow Creek twice more before Christmas, both times on legitimate business. Each time, he stopped in the kitchen doorway for a cup of coffee. Each time, the conversation was brief, unhurried, and revealed small things. That he'd come to Montana from Ohio at the age of 19 with $47 and no particular plan. That he read when he could, though mostly practical things, surveying manuals, land law, the occasional agricultural report. That he hadn't been back east in 11 years. Clara told him she was from a farming family in the southern part of the territory. That her father had lost the farm the year she was 18. That she'd been in domestic service ever since, which was a plain way of saying something that was both true and carefully simplified. Neither of them referred to the note again. Neither of them named what the mornings in the kitchen doorway were. But the firewood stack in the breezeway stayed full, even after the supply wagon started running again. And on a Sunday in mid-December, she came in from the cold storage to find a new rolling pin on the work table, the old one having been cracked for months. The new one was plain, well-made, exactly the right weight. There was no note. There never was, after the first one. Clara picked it up, felt the balance of it in her hands, and set it down beside the flour sack. She had the thought that she should tell him to stop. She had the thought that she should say something to Pruitt, establish a clarity about what her position here was and what it wasn't. She had the thought that she'd been careful about these things her whole adult life for good reason, and that careful was what had kept her employed and housed and safe. She had all of those thoughts, one after another, standing at the work table in the quiet kitchen. And then she started on the bread. And in the late afternoon, when the bread was cooling on the rack and the yard outside was going dim and the fire in the stove had settled into a long, patient burn, she began to sing. The window was closed against the December cold. The sound didn't carry far. But she sang anyway, and her voice in the small room was the one place all year that hadn't felt like it belonged to someone else. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The winter ahead was long. She didn't know what was coming in the weeks after Christmas, didn't know what would change, or how, or whether the careful distance between the kitchen doorway and everything else would hold or eventually give way. She didn't know any of it. She just knew the bread smelled right, and the fire was steady, and outside in the frozen Montana dusk, somewhere on the road north, a man on a tall bay horse was riding home with the memory of her voice following him in the dark. The new year arrived at Barrow Creek without ceremony. There was no celebration to speak of. The hands drank a little whiskey in the bunkhouse on New Year's Eve. Pruitt went to bed at his usual hour, and Clara stayed in the kitchen until nearly midnight doing inventory of the cold storage and writing out a list of supplies that needed replenishing before February. She blew out the lamp just after 12 and walked across the frozen yard to her room in the side quarters, with her breath making ghosts in the dark air and the stars overhead so sharp and dense they looked like they'd been pressed into the sky with a nail. January was cold at the way that Montana Januaries are cold. Not dramatic about it, just steady and complete. The kind of cold that doesn't threaten you so much as simply install itself and refuse to leave. The creek froze solid all the way across. The cattle needed more feed. The mornings were black until nearly 8 o'clock. Clara settled into the rhythm of it. She'd lived through enough hard winters to know that rhythm was the thing that got you through. If you kept moving, kept the stove fed, kept the meals coming on time, the weeks would eventually pass whether you noticed them or not. What she noticed instead was the way the kitchen felt different since December. Not physically different. The room was the same cracked plaster above the stove, same warped floorboard near the left-hand sink that she'd learned to step around, same iron hooks on the wall, same window that let in the pale morning light at an angle that swept across the work table and then disappeared by mid-morning when the sun moved. But the quality of the silence in the room had shifted. It was harder to explain than she would have liked. She'd gotten used to the mornings in the doorway. Colton Ashford and his coffee and his particular unhurried way of occupying a space without demanding anything from it. She'd gotten used to looking up and finding him there and not being startled by it, which was its own kind of thing. He hadn't come since the second week of December. That was 6 weeks ago. She told herself it was business. It probably was business. He was a man with 12,000 acres and several hundred employees and any number of legitimate reasons to be occupied from one end of the territory to the other. She told herself she hadn't been tracking the days. She told herself the kitchen felt exactly the same as it always had. She was a reasonable woman who had learned to be honest with herself about most things. She knew she was lying about the kitchen. Ortiz. He came back on a Thursday in the third week of January, and he didn't come alone. Clara heard the horses before she saw them. 3 riders coming through the gate at mid-morning, which was unusual. She looked up from the stove and through the window saw Colton Ashford on his bay horse, and beside him 2 men she didn't recognize, both of them well-dressed in the particular way of men who come from money and have stopped needing to think about it. They went to the main house. She went back to the stove. 20 minutes later, Pruitt came through the breezeway door with a look on his face she'd come to recognize as his meeting with important people expression. Slightly compressed, slightly formal, like he was holding his face in a shape it didn't naturally take. "We'll need lunch in the sitting room," he said. 4 men. Whatever you can put together. Noon? Noon is fine. He left. She looked at what she had in the cold storage in the pantry and did the arithmetic and started cooking. At noon, she brought in a tray, sliced cold beef, bread, pickled vegetables, a pot of beans she'd had simmering since morning, coffee. She set it on the side table and was turning to leave when one of the men she didn't know said something she caught the edge of. "Remarkable that you'd ride all the way out to a working ranch for a kitchen girl." She didn't stop walking. She made it back through the breezeway door and closed it behind her with careful, measured quietness, and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands at her sides. Kitchen girl. Not said with cruelty exactly. Said the way people say things they consider to be simply descriptive. Observations, not attacks. Which was almost worse because it meant the man who'd said it had thought it was a neutral statement, that it was only accurate. She picked up the rolling pin, the new one, the one with the good balance, and held it in both hands, not doing anything with it, just holding it, until the particular tightness in her chest eased enough to work. The rumors started in February. She didn't know how these things started. She never did. One morning there was nothing, And then a few days later, she'd hear something that had clearly been circulating for a while already, smoothed down and passed along. And she'd understand that she was the last to know about a version of her own life that other people had been discussing among themselves. The version that was circulating in early February was this: that Clara Bennett, the cook at Barrow Creek Ranch, had set her sights on Colton Ashford and was making herself available to him whenever he rode out to check on his land deal with Pruitt. She heard this from an unlikely source: Marta Eisen, the wife of a farmer who lived 4 miles south and sometimes came to the ranch to trade eggs for flour. Marta was a plain-spoken woman in her 40s who delivered the information not with malice, but with the tired practicality of someone who thought a warning was a kindness. "People are talking," Marta said, standing in the kitchen doorway with her basket of eggs. "Town talk. I don't say it's true. I say it's going around." "What are they saying exactly?" Clara asked, because she wanted to know the precise shape of it. Marta set her basket on the work table. "That you've been making yourself useful to him in ways that go beyond cooking." Clara looked at the eggs, 12 of them, brown, clean. "That's not true," she said. "I know it," Marta said. "But truth and what people say about truth aren't always the same thing out here, and I thought you should know." Clara counted out this flour in exchange for the eggs. She thanked Marta for telling her. She walked Marta to the yard gate and watched her drive her wagon back south on the frozen road. Then she went back to the kitchen and stood at the work table for a long time. The thing about rumors she knew from experience was that they didn't need much to start. They needed only a single observable fact, and then someone willing to fill in the space around it with whatever story seemed most plausible or interesting. The observable fact in this case was probably simple enough. Colton Ashford, who did not need to personally supervise a land deal that his lawyers and Pruitt could handle without him, had nonetheless made several personal visits to Barrow Creek Ranch over the past few months. That was a real thing that had happened. The explanation that would make the most sense to people who didn't know the rest of it would be the most obvious one. She thought about the note on the windowsill, the firewood, the repaired hinge, the tea and the rolling pin. She thought about standing in a kitchen doorway on a January morning and the particular quality of a silence shared with someone who didn't feel the need to fill it. None of that was visible to anyone else. What was visible was a rich man making repeated trips to a working ranch to see a woman nobody thought much of. Of course, people had made it into something. She didn't see Colton for the next 2 weeks, which was partly coincidence and partly because she started making herself scarce when she heard horses at the gate. Staying in the pantry, going to the cold storage, finding reasons not to be in the kitchen doorway at the hours when he might have stopped. She also stopped singing. She didn't make a conscious decision about it. It just stopped. The evenings after supper that had been hers, the hour or so when the kitchen was quiet and the fire was steady, and she'd let herself inhabit the space in a way that was different from working. Those evenings now felt exposed somehow, like the window was too clear and the sound carried too far, and what had felt private was maybe not as private as she'd believed. She washed the dishes in silence. She banked the stove. She went to her room. It was Cal, the older hand, who noticed first. He said nothing for 3 days, and then on the 4th day he came to the kitchen at mid-morning under the thin pretext of needing something from the pantry. He'd sent Ira for pantry items every other time in the 11 months she'd been there, and he stood at the work table while she rolled out biscuit dough and eventually said, "You stopped singing." "I wasn't aware I was doing it loud enough for anyone to hear," she said. "You weren't," he said. "That's how I know you stopped." She cut biscuits without answering. "It's none of my business," Cal said. "No," she agreed pleasantly. He got what he'd come for from the pantry, a coil of rawhide lace that had no business being in the pantry, and left. But the thing he'd said stayed with her. "That's how I know you stopped." She had thought she was invisible in the kitchen. She had thought the things that happened inside it when she was alone were hers and no one else's. The discovery that they were at least partially observable, that even what she thought she was keeping to herself had left some trace, sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. Mom. Colton came on a Thursday in early March, alone this time, and he came later in the day than usual. Clara heard his horse, but she was deep in the pantry counting flour sacks, and she told herself she'd stay there until she was done, and she meant it, and then she heard his voice in the breezeway. Not calling for her, just saying something to Pruitt, who was apparently out there, and she finished her count and came out. He was in the kitchen doorway. Pruitt had already gone back toward the main house. She registered that detail. Just Colton in the doorway, holding his hat in one hand and looking at her in a way she hadn't seen from him before. More direct than usual, more like he'd decided something. "You weren't at the window this morning," he said. She picked up her flour sack and set it on the work table and began measuring. "I had pantry work." "You've been in the pantry the last 2 times I came." She measured a cup of flour, leveled it off, set it aside. "Is that a question?" He came one step into the kitchen. Just one. "Did I do something?" She looked up. The directness in his face was something she hadn't prepared for. It didn't have any armor to it, which meant she couldn't meet it with armor of her own, without feeling like she was attacking something that had come at her without defenses. She set down the measuring cup. "People are talking," she said. "In town. At the neighboring farms." He waited. "About what your visits here mean," she said. "About what I'm supposed to be doing to encourage them." Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, which told her he'd heard some version of this already, or at least suspected it. "What are they saying?" "That I'm trying to get above my station," she said flatly. "That's the polite version." The muscle in his jaw worked once. "And the impolite version." "I think you can fill that in." He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "And you believe—" "I don't believe it," she said. "I'm telling you, it's being said. There's a difference." "Is that why you stopped singing?" The question landed in the room with more weight than she expected. She thought he didn't know about the singing, that had always been the assumption, that it was private, that whatever he'd heard through the window that first night had been accidental and hadn't been repeated. The fact that he knew she'd stopped meant he'd been paying close enough attention to notice the absence of something he'd never been supposed to be listening for. She felt a flush of something she couldn't name. Not anger, not embarrassment, somewhere in between. "That's—" she started. "I'm sorry," he said. "That wasn't fair to ask." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He put his hat back on and she thought he was going to leave. Instead he said, "Come outside for a minute." "I'm in the middle of—" "The biscuits can wait 10 minutes. She looked at the work table. She looked at him. She took off her apron and hung it on the hook by the door and followed him out. He walked her to the east side of the yard, away from the bunkhouse and the corral, where Ira and 2 other hands were working, to a section of fence that looked out over the creek bottom and the frozen willows along the bank. The March afternoon was cold but still, not sharp, just gray and quiet, the light flat and even under a sheet of overcast sky. He stood at the fence and looked out for a moment before he spoke. "I know what it looks like," he said. "From the outside, I know how people read it." He paused. "I can't tell you it doesn't matter what they say because I know it does. Not to me, but to you, and that's not the same thing." Clara stood beside him with her arms crossed against the cold, not looking at him. "I didn't come out here to cause you problems," he said. That was never what this was." "What was it then?" she asked. And she kept her voice level, careful, because she genuinely wanted to know the answer, and she didn't trust herself to hear it clearly if she let anything else into the question. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I heard something real. That first night through the window, I don't hear many real things." She looked at him then. He was watching the frozen creek with an expression she couldn't quite sort out. Not uncomfortable, but like the words had cost something. "I'm a rich man," he said. "Most people know what that means before they've met me. They've already decided who I am and what I want and how I should be talked to. I'm not complaining about it. That's just how it goes. But it means that most of what you hear after a while is people telling you what they think you want to hear. And most of what you say comes out already shaped by what you know about yourself that other people are thinking." He stopped. "That's a poor way of explaining it." "No," she said quietly. "I follow it." "You were singing," he said. "You didn't know I was there. It wasn't for anyone. It was just real. I hadn't heard something just real in a while." He paused again. "I'm not saying it well." "You're saying it fine," she said. They stood at the fence for another moment. Below them, the creek was solid white between its gray-brown banks, and somewhere in the willows a bird was making a quiet, persistent sound she didn't know the name of. "I should get back," she said finally. "I know." She turned back toward the kitchen. She'd gone a few steps when she stopped without fully deciding to. "Mr. Ashford." "Colton," he said. She didn't turn around. "You should know that the singing, I don't do it for anyone. I never have. I don't intend to start." She paused. "But I don't intend to stop either." She heard him exhale something that might have been the beginning of a laugh, or might have been something else. She walked back to the kitchen. She put her apron back on. She finished the biscuits. She didn't look out the window when she heard him ride out an hour later. But the kitchen felt like itself again. Like the room she'd been in before February made her feel watched. She couldn't explain why. She just noticed it, and noticed that it mattered more than she'd expected. The biscuits turned out well. They always did, when she wasn't distracted. Spring came late and badly that year. April brought a week of warm days that turned the road to mud, and then 3 days of hard frost that froze it again with deep ruts that would last until June, which made supply runs difficult and put everyone's temper on a short wire. 2 of the hands quit at the end of April, a common enough event in the spring, when men who'd been cooped up through winter got restless and started moving. Pruitt hired replacements from a labor office in Mineral Falls, and they arrived the first week of May, smelling like town and looking at the work with the cautious eyes of men who'd agreed to something without fully understanding what they'd agreed to. Clara fed them like she fed everyone else, without preference or prejudice. Same plate for the new men as for the men who'd been there 3 years. Cal watched the new hands with the mild suspicion he applied to most things and said nothing in particular about any of them, which was his way of saying he'd reserve judgment. The one thing that changed in April was that word had apparently reached Mineral Falls about Colton Ashford's trips to Barrow Creek. Clara knew this because one of Pruitt's cousins, a woman named Helen, who occasionally came to visit, showed up in the second week of April and spent 20 minutes in the kitchen on the thin excuse of wanting to learn Clara's bread recipe while actually angling toward a conversation about Colton Ashford and what Clara's understanding of the situation was. Clara gave her the bread recipe, which was not secret and which she would have given anyone who asked, and answered Helen's angled questions with the patience of someone who'd spent a long time dealing with angled questions by just not going in the direction they were aimed at. "He's been very kind," Clara said, when the questions pointed that direction. "And do you think—" Helen started. "I think the ranch is well managed and Pruitt does good work," Clara said pleasantly, and offered her more coffee. Helen left without the information she'd come for, but her visit confirmed something Clara had already suspected. The conversation about her and Colton Ashford had expanded beyond the nearest farms and was now fully a feature of the social landscape in Mineral Falls. She didn't know what form it was taking over there, whether people were dismissive of her, sympathetic to her, or simply entertained by the idea of her. And she found she genuinely couldn't tell which of those possibilities was most tolerable. What she knew was that she hadn't asked for any of it. She'd been in a kitchen, washing dishes, singing to herself. That was the sum total of what she'd done. She found it deeply unfair in a way she'd learned not to say out loud, because saying something was unfair in the Montana Territory in 1887 was roughly equivalent to announcing that water was wet. It didn't change anything. It just reminded everyone that you expected the world to operate differently than it did. The journal appeared on the windowsill on a morning in early May when the sky had finally cleared and the first real warmth of the year was coming through the glass and laying itself across the work table in a pale yellow strip. It was not a fancy journal, not leather-bound, not expensive-looking. It had a cloth cover in a faded blue, about 40 pages, with lined paper inside. On the first page, in handwriting she recognized, someone had written, "Write down the songs before they disappear." The world is full of things that disappear because nobody wrote them down. There was no signature. Clara sat on the stool by the work table and held the journal with both hands and read the sentence twice. She thought about the songs her mother had taught her, the ones that had come down imperfectly, words changed or forgotten. Melodies that existed in slightly different versions in different households because nobody had written them down, and each person who remembered them differently. She thought about the ones she'd invented half-consciously herself, in the evenings in the kitchen, that she'd never sung the same way twice because she'd never thought of them as fixed things, things that deserved to be preserved, before they disappear. She sat there for long enough that the flower needed to be started. She set the journal in the corner of the work table, carefully, away from the flour and the steam. That night she opened it and sat at the table in the lamplight and wrote down the first song. It took her a long time. She kept second-guessing the words, crossing things out, finding that what she heard in her head when she sang didn't translate easily into written-down language, that a song on paper was a different animal than a song in the air. But she finished it. The words looked strange on the page, flat and still, in a way they'd never been inside her chest, but they were down. She wrote 3 more over the following week, then a 5th. Then she started writing down fragments, partial verses, half-formed melodies she tried to approximate with written descriptions of the rhythm, which felt awkward and not quite right but was better than nothing. Colton came by in the 3rd week of May on legitimate business with Pruitt about the land deal that had apparently reached some point of negotiation that required his direct involvement. He stopped in the kitchen doorway in the morning. She gave him coffee. "Did you find it?" he asked, without preamble, which was his manner. "Yes," she said. He looked at the journal on the corner of the work table, and something in his face was careful in a way she noticed. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know I didn't have to." "People will say things," she said. "More things. If they know." "People are already saying things," he said. She looked at the journal. It had 7 songs in it now, and 12 fragments, and the beginning of something she hadn't entirely figured out yet. A new thing that was partly a melody she'd heard somewhere, and partly something that had come up out of the evenings alone in the kitchen and didn't belong to any other source she could name. "I know," she said. She brought him a second cup of coffee without being asked, which she'd never done before. He didn't make anything of it. He just drank it and talked about the fencing costs on the east section, and at some point Pruitt appeared and pulled him toward the main house, and the morning moved on. But the journal stayed on the corner of the work table, and in the evenings, when the kitchen was hers, she wrote in it, and she sang while she wrote, and the window was open now that May had come, and the sound went out into the spring air, and she didn't try to stop it. She was aware of what she was doing. She was also aware that she'd spent 11 months on this ranch being useful and careful and invisible, and something had shifted in the balance of it. Some weight had moved from one side to the other, and she wasn't entirely sure when it had happened or whether she could move it back. She wasn't sure she wanted to. In the last week of May, something happened that made the question of wanting irrelevant, at least temporarily. Colton came to Barrow Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, and he didn't come in through the gate. He came across the east pasture on horseback and stopped at the fence line on the far side and waved her over when she looked out the window, which she registered as a departure from his usual pattern. She dried her hands and walked out across the yard and through the pasture gate to where he was sitting his horse on the other side of the fence. "I'd like to show you something," he said. "Can you ride?" She looked at him. "I have a horse tied at the south post," he said. "Gentle. It'll take 20 minutes." She'd been on horseback a handful of times. She wasn't a rider by any stretch, but she knew the basics. "What are you showing me?" she asked. "Something that'll be easier to understand when you see it than when I try to explain it," he said. She looked back at the kitchen. Lunch was done. Supper wasn't for 3 hours. She said, "Give me 5 minutes," and went back in to bank the stove. The horse he had for her was a dun mare, steady and unhurried, which suited Clara's uncertain riding exactly right. They went south from the ranch property and then east, climbing gradually up through the pasture land and into the timber, and then up through the timber on a trail she hadn't known existed, until they came out above the tree line onto a long rocky shoulder of land that fell away sharply to the south and the west, and from it you could see everything. She pulled the mare to a stop and just looked. The Ashford Ranch was spread below them. Even from this height, she could see the scale of it, the vast reach of grassland, the river drainage that formed the eastern boundary, the cluster of buildings near the center, the cattle moving like small, dark punctuation marks across the pale grass. Beyond it to the west was the valley, and beyond that the mountains, and above everything a sky that was the particular shade of late May blue that only exists in high country when the air is still clean enough to have no color of its own. "That's yours," she said. "Most of what you can see," he said. He was beside her on the bay, his hat tipped back, looking not at the land but at her. She was aware of him looking. She kept her eyes on the view. "It's something." "Yes," he said. "It is." He paused. "I come up here sometimes when I need to remember that." "Remember what?" "That it's real," he said. "That I actually built it." There are days when it doesn't feel like mine, exactly. It feels like something I'm managing for someone else, something that requires constant tending or it falls apart. He stopped. That probably sounds ungrateful. No, she said. It sounds honest. He looked at the land for a moment. My foreman thinks I'm going soft in my old age, he said. Riding out to listen to a woman sing through a kitchen window? Are you? She asked. Going soft? Probably, he said, without sounding bothered by it. The wind came up for a moment across the ridge, cool and carrying the smell of pine and faraway snow still on the high peaks. Claire's mare shifted beneath her, one patient step to the right, and settled again. I own 12,000 acres, he said. I can go anywhere on this land, and I have. Every section of it. I know where the water is and where the grass gives out in late summer and which draws fill up with snow first in November. He paused. I don't have a place on it that feels like home. She looked at him then. His face was angular in the afternoon light, the gray at his temples more visible than it looked indoors. He wasn't making a speech. He wasn't trying to say something calculated. He was just saying the true thing, which she recognized because she'd heard him do it before. That particular unguarded directness that she'd thought at first was a manner but had come to understand was just how he talked when he wasn't talking to impress anyone. Where does it feel like? She asked. If not home. He looked at her steadily. Wherever the coffee is hot, and no one wants anything from me. She turned back to the view. Her throat felt tight in a way she wasn't going to comment on. That's a low bar, she said. You'd think, he said. She took a breath of the cool, high air. Below them, the land ran out in every direction to the limits of what she could see. Enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the way that enormous, indifferent things sometimes were. The songs will disappear, she said, after a while. Not to him exactly. More to herself or to the view, but he was there and she said it. The ones my mother taught me. Even with the journal. I can write down the words, but the sound of her voice is already gone. I can't get that back. He was quiet. That's the part that disappears, she said. You can preserve the thing itself sometimes, but the particular way it lived in someone, that goes with them. Yes, he said. She didn't know why she'd said it. She didn't fully know what she'd meant by it. But it had been the true thing in that moment, and she'd said it, and it sat between them in the spring air without needing to be explained further. They rode back down as the afternoon light turned golden and low, and she made supper, and the evening came on like all the other evenings. And she sang while she did the dishes. And the window was open, and the sound went out into the warm May dark. She didn't think about home. She thought about the view from the ridge, and the way the land looked from up there, manageable, somehow, comprehensible in a way it wasn't when you were inside it. And she thought about a man who owned all of it and couldn't find a place on it that felt like rest. She thought about that longer than she meant to, and then she finished the dishes, and she closed the journal for the night, and she banked the stove fire and listened to it settle in the dark. Outside, the stars came out over Montana, and the land went quiet under them, and the creek ran cold and steady in its banks, and somewhere in the night a door was open that she hadn't decided yet whether to walk through. The Barrow Creek Frontier Celebration had been running every June since the territory was young enough that the people who started it were still alive to argue about how it should be run. It occupied the better part of 3 days, Friday through Sunday, the second weekend of June, and took over the main street of Mineral Falls with the particular organized chaos of an event that had been repeated often enough to have traditions, but not often enough for anyone to fully agree on what those traditions were. There were horse races on Saturday morning. There was a fiddle competition on Friday evening. There were food stalls and a livestock auction and a traveling photographer who set up a tent at the north end of the street and charged $2 to sit for a portrait, which was expensive enough that most people walked past the tent twice before deciding against it. The saloons did exceptional business. The territorial newspaper sent a correspondent who wrote the same article every year with the names changed. Clara had not attended the previous year. She'd had no particular reason to go, and she'd spent the weekend at the ranch, which was quieter than usual with most of the hands in town, catching up on the kind of slow kitchen work that was hard to do when meals needed producing on schedule. This year was different, and the reason it was different was Douglas Pruitt. He came to her on a Thursday morning, 2 days before the celebration, with the manner of a man who was asking something he'd been putting off. Mrs. Hollis at the Mineral Falls Hotel is short a pair of hands for the celebration weekend, he said. They're running a supper service Friday and Saturday evening, and she asked if I could loan her someone for the kitchen. He paused. I told her I'd ask. Clara looked at him. You told her you'd ask, or you told her yes? Pruitt's expression shifted approximately 2 degrees toward uncomfortable. I told her I'd ask, he said. But she's a friend of the owner's wife, and I'll go, Clara said. She hadn't planned to say it, but it came out before she'd fully worked through the reasons for it, and once it was said it felt more right than wrong, so she let it stand. Pruitt looked relieved in the small, compressed way he expressed relief. You'd stay at the hotel Friday and Saturday night. Mrs. Hollis will have a room for you. That's fine, Clara said. It was only after he had left that she thought about what it would mean, being in Mineral Falls for the celebration weekend, in the same town where the speculation about her and Colton Ashford had been circulating for months. She thought about it and decided it didn't change anything. She was a cook doing kitchen work. That was all she'd ever been and all she was going to be this weekend. And if anyone had something to say about it, they could say it to her face, which, in her experience, was a deterrent, because people who talked behind your back rarely had the same enthusiasm for the conversation when it was happening in front of you. She arrived in Mineral Falls on Friday afternoon on the back of the supply wagon, sitting beside a barrel of salt pork that had been going to town anyway. The main street was already filling up, families from the outlying ranches and farms coming in for the weekend, horses tied 6 deep at the rails outside the saloons, children running in groups between the stalls that were being assembled along the boardwalk. The smell of the town in summer was different from the smell of the ranch. Wood smoke and horse and frying meat, and the particular dusty warmth of packed earth that had been walked on all day. Mrs. Hollis was a small, brisk woman in her 60s who ran the Mineral Falls Hotel with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped expecting anything to go entirely to plan and had built her operations around that expectation. She met Clara at the kitchen door, looked her over once, showed her where things were, and said, Supper service starts at 6. We'll have 40 people, maybe 50. I have 2 girls helping, but they're not experienced. You'll be the one who knows what she's doing, but... I understand, Clara said. Good. Mrs. Hollis handed her an apron. The beef's in the cold room and the pies are from this morning. Everything else is yours to figure out. Clara put on the apron and started figuring. The Friday supper went well. 43 people, it turned out, ranging from ranch families to the territorial correspondent and a pair of businessmen from Helena who were in town for the land auction that was running alongside the celebration. Clara kept her head down and the food moving and didn't have cause to leave the kitchen all evening. Afterward, Mrs. Hollis paid her the agreed amount and told her the room was the second on the left at the top of the stairs. And Clara went to it and slept without any particular difficulty because she was tired and the bed was better than the one at the ranch. Saturday was when things changed. But she spent Saturday morning helping with the hotel breakfast and the early prep for the evening supper, and by mid-afternoon Mrs. Hollis told her she had a few hours free before the kitchen needed her back. Clara untied her apron, washed her face, and went out into the street. The celebration was at its peak. The fiddle competition had concluded, and its winner, a 15-year-old from a farm north of town, was playing on the boardwalk outside the general store to a crowd that didn't need any official designation to gather. The livestock auction was winding down. Children were everywhere. The air smelled of popcorn and horse, and the particular sweetness of the lemonade a woman was selling from a cart near the hotel steps. Clara walked the length of the main street and back, looking at things without any particular agenda. She bought a piece of gingerbread from one of the stalls and ate it standing in a doorway, watching the crowd move. It occurred to her that she hadn't been in a crowd like this in over a year. She'd been at the ranch long enough that the ordinary human density of a town day felt slightly overwhelming in a way she couldn't explain. She saw Colton Ashford from across the street. He was with 3 men she didn't know, standing outside the land office that had apparently been opened for the weekend to handle the auction business. He was doing what he did in crowds, which was occupy his space without taking up more than he needed, listening more than talking, hat tipped against the afternoon sun, boots planted like he'd been standing there for 100 years. One of the men with him was talking with the energetic gestures of a man making a point he was certain of. Colton nodded occasionally. His eyes moved over the crowd in the way of a man who's learned to be aware of his surroundings without looking like he's doing it. He found her. Across the width of the main street, through the moving crowd, he found her standing in the doorway with a piece of gingerbread in her hand, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he said something to the men he was with and started across the street. Clara stayed where she was. She finished the gingerbread. She watched him come. "I didn't know you were coming to town," he said when he reached her. "Mrs. Hollis needed kitchen help for the celebration supper." He looked at the street, then back at her. "How's the gingerbread?" "Heavy," she said, "but that's how I like it." Something almost like a smile. "Are you free right now?" "Until 4 o'clock. "Walk with me," he said. She looked at the main street, at the crowd, at the complete visibility of it all. She thought about Marta Eisen and Helen Pruitt and every angled conversation that had come her way since February. She thought about the kitchen ridge above the Ashford land and the way the territory had looked from up there, comprehensible from the right height. "All right," she said. "Mom." They walked to the end of the main street and then south along the quieter road that ran behind the hotel, away from the crowd. It was easier to talk there. They walked without particular urgency, and she told him about the Friday supper and Mrs. Hollis's kitchen, which was organized differently than the one at Barrow Creek and had taken some getting used to. He told her about the land auction, which had gone roughly as expected except for a section in the northeast corner that had gone for twice the estimated price to a buyer from Billings, who'd apparently sent an agent with more authority than sense. It was the kind of conversation that didn't require anything from either of them, except presence. She'd noticed before that being around him didn't require performance, that she could say the plain thing without dressing it up, and he'd receive it that way without expecting more. She didn't have many people in her life that conversation worked that way with. They turned back toward the main street when her 4 o'clock was approaching. They were a half block from the hotel, still on the quieter road, when the woman stepped out of the side entrance of the Cattlemen's Club and stopped directly in their path. Clara didn't know her name immediately. She recognized the type before she recognized the person, the quality of the clothes, the particular angle of a woman who has spent her life understanding exactly where she is in a room's hierarchy and expects that understanding to be shared. She was perhaps 50, handsome in a sharp-edged way, with dark hair going gray at the front and eyes that did the kind of rapid assessment that reads a situation in about 3 seconds and files it accordingly. The assessment landed on Clara first, then on Colton, then back on Clara. "Colton," the woman said. Her voice was precisely warm. The warmth of good breeding applied as consistently as a coat of lacquer. "I didn't know you were in town." "Mrs. Hartfield," he said. "Good afternoon. I see you've brought a friend." The word friend did something in her mouth that the word itself didn't ordinarily do. "This is Clara Bennett," Colton said. She's been at Barrow Creek this past year." "Ah," Mrs. Hartfield said. And in that single syllable was the entire content of every rumor that had been circulating in Mineral Falls since February. The knowing quality of it, the faint satisfaction of having a suspicion confirmed, the social apparatus of a woman who understood exactly how to make a single word do the work of a sentence. Clara said, "Good afternoon," because she wasn't going to let the moment pass without her own voice in it. Mrs. Hartfield looked at her directly for the first time. "You're the one who cooks?" she said. "I am," Clara said. "How useful," Mrs. Hartfield said. And then, to Colton, with the smooth pivot of someone returning to the conversation that mattered, "You should come to the Cattlemen's Supper Sunday evening. Half the territory will be there. It would be good for people to see you." "I'll think about it," Colton said, which Clara recognized as his version of no. "Bring whoever you like," Mrs. Hartfield added with a brief, precise glance at Clara that contained multitudes. Then she moved on down the road with the unhurried assurance of a woman who had said exactly what she meant and meant every word of it. The silence she left behind was brief, but it had a shape to it. "Don't," Colton said. "Don't what?" Claire asked. "Whatever you're about to say to yourself," he said. "Don't." She looked at the road ahead. "I was going to say I need to get back to Mrs. Hollis's kitchen." "Right," he said. She walked back to the hotel. She did not look at him when she said goodbye, which wasn't rudeness, just the particular way you sometimes have to manage things when the thing you're managing is the inside of your own chest. The Saturday evening supper service was busy. 51 people, which was more than Friday, and the crowd included a higher proportion of the town's prominent families. The ranching money and the banking money and the merchant money that formed the upper tier of Mineral Falls society, all gathered in the hotel dining room with the slightly elevated energy of people who have been drinking lemonade in the sun all afternoon and have moved on to something stronger. Clara stayed in the kitchen. That was fine. The kitchen was where she understood what was expected of her. She was plating the third course, a roasted beef with potatoes, simple enough but time-consuming to do in volume. When she heard it, she wasn't supposed to hear it. The kitchen door was mostly closed and the dining room sounds came through muffled and general, the particular wash of many conversations layered over each other. But there was a moment when a gap opened in the sound, when the nearest conversations happened to drop off at the same time. And in that gap she heard a woman's voice, clear and carrying, say, "Honestly, what does he think the rest of us are supposed to make of it? A cook! She can barely read, I'd imagine." And then the gap closed and the conversation wall filled back in. Clara set the plate down on the service counter. She picked up the next plate. She kept moving. One of the young girls helping her that evening, a farmer's daughter named Dottie, maybe 16, who had been watching Clara work with the focused attention of someone trying to absorb a skill quickly, said, "You all right, Miss Bennett?" "Fine," Clara said. "Hand me that ladle." She finished the service. She cleaned the kitchen with the same methodical attention she brought to every kitchen she'd ever worked in. She thanked Mrs. Hollis and accepted her payment and went up to the room at the top of the stairs. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while. She can barely read, I'd imagine. She could read. She could read quite well, as it happened. She had read every book she'd ever had access to, which hadn't been many, but which she'd gone through multiple times with the thoroughness of someone to whom books were not abundant. She had read surveying manuals and almanacs and 2 novels and a volume of natural history and a legal compendium she'd found in a previous employer's library that she'd worked through with a dictionary because she'd found the language interesting. She kept the journal now, which she wrote in nearly every night. Her mother had taught her from a school reader when she was small, and she'd been grateful for it ever since. She can barely read, I'd imagine. The woman hadn't known any of that. She hadn't needed to know it. She'd made her assessment on the information she had, Cook, Barrow Creek Ranch, associated with Colton Ashford in some undefined way, and the assessment had produced that sentence, which had been said not even to wound Clara directly, but simply as a thing that was probably true and worth saying. That was the part that sat in her chest like a stone. Not the cruelty of it, the casualness. She thought about leaving. She thought about it seriously. Packing the small bag she'd brought, getting on the supply wagon when it went back Sunday morning, collecting her things from the ranch, writing Pruitt a letter, explaining that she was moving on. It wasn't the first time she'd moved on from a situation that had stopped being workable, and it probably wouldn't be the last, and she had the practical skills to find another position without much difficulty. The world was large. Montana was large. There were kitchens elsewhere that didn't have this particular tangle attached to them. She sat with that possibility for a long time. Then she opened the journal she'd brought with her. She'd started bringing it everywhere, which she hadn't planned. It had just started traveling in her bag. And she read through some of what she'd written, not performing the reading, just looking at it. The songs her mother had taught her, preserved now in her own handwriting, imperfect but permanent. The fragments she'd been working on. The half-finished thing that had been developing since spring, the one that was partly borrowed and partly entirely her own. The world is full of things that disappear because nobody wrote them down. She closed the journal. She was not going to leave. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd been in a kitchen, doing her work, and something had happened that she hadn't asked for, and the social machinery of Mineral Falls had made it into a story about a woman reaching above herself, and she was supposed to be ashamed and disappear and make it easier for everyone else to pretend the whole thing hadn't happened. She understood the logic of it. She just didn't agree with it. She was going to go back to Barrow Creek on Sunday morning, and she was going to cook breakfast and lunch and supper, and she was going to write in her journal in the evenings, and she was going to sing, and if Colton Ashford stopped in the kitchen doorway for coffee, then he stopped in the kitchen doorway for coffee. And if that continued to give Mineral Falls something to talk about, then Mineral Falls would just have to keep talking. She turned out the lamp and lay back on the hotel bed and listened to the sounds of the celebration winding down on the street below. The distant music, the horses, the conversations moving past the window, until they gradually quieted and she slept. She was wrong about one thing. She wasn't going back on Sunday morning. Sunday morning arrived with an atmosphere that was different from the previous 2 days. The particular flatness that settles over a celebration when it's mostly done, and people are finishing up and heading home, and the main street has that post-event vacancy, empty stalls and trampled ground, and the general evidence of a crowd that has been and gone. Clara came down early, helped Mrs. Hollis with the breakfast service, and was in the middle of washing the last of the breakfast dishes when she heard raised voices from the hotel's front room. She didn't go out. It wasn't her business. Then she heard her name. She put down the dishcloth and went to the kitchen door and pushed it open 2 inches and listened. The voice was a woman's, not Mrs. Hartfield, but a similar register, the confident, carrying tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. Brought that Bennett girl right through the main street yesterday afternoon, bold as anything. My herald saw them. The whole town saw them. Another voice, lower, less certain. Well, he can walk where he likes. It's not about walking, it's about what it says. A man in his position, associating himself publicly with a kitchen servant, it reflects on all of us. It reflects on every woman in this territory who has maintained her. I don't see what I'm supposed to do about it, Mrs. Hollis said, and Clara recognized the brisk neutrality of a woman who wanted to end a conversation without taking a side. You employed her, the first woman said. That's an endorsement. I employed her to cook, Mrs. Hollis said. She cooked. Very well, as it happens. That's hardly... The front door of the hotel opened and the voices shifted, and Clara let the kitchen door close. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, then she went back to the dishes. She was drying the last plate when she heard someone on the hotel steps, and then boots on the wooden floor of the lobby. And then Colton Ashford was in the kitchen doorway. He looked like a man who had heard something. His jaw was set and his eyes had the quality she'd seen in him exactly once before, on the road when Mrs. Hartfield had deployed that single-weighted syllable, the quality of a man who has been patient a long time and has reached the end of something. Are you ready to go? He said. The supply wagon isn't until noon, she said. I have horses, he said. She looked at him. You heard. I heard enough, he said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. It doesn't matter, she said. It was already being said. I heard it last night. Something shifted in his face. What did you hear last night? She told him. She kept her voice flat and plain, the same way she'd kept it flat and plain when she'd told him about Marta Eisen's warning in February, because the facts were damaging enough without adding any additional feeling to them, and she wasn't going to hand anyone the spectacle of her being wounded by it. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to say something. All right. Not here, he said. Come with me. Colton, please, he said. She had not heard him say that word before. It changed the texture of the request. She hung up the dish towel, untied her apron, picked up her bag from beside the door, and followed him out. He did not take her to the horses. He walked her up the main street. It was mid-morning on Sunday, and the street wasn't empty. There were still families finishing their weekends, still wagons being loaded, still men on the boardwalk with coffee cups from the hotel's breakfast service. The celebration had wound down, but the town hadn't emptied yet, and there were enough people present that what happened next would be witnessed by a fair cross-section of Mineral Falls society. Clara realized what he was doing when he stopped in the middle of the main street, near the empty platform that had been used for the fiddle competition the previous evening. She put her hand on his arm. You don't need to... Yes, I do, he said. He wasn't loud about it. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't climb onto the platform, or wave his hat, or do anything that would have turned it into a performance. He simply turned to the nearest cluster of people, 3 men she didn't know, and a woman who she recognized as one of the voices from the hotel front room that morning. And he said, in a carrying, unhurried voice, I want to say something, if you'll hear it. People turned. Not everyone, not all at once, but the way people turn on a quiet Sunday morning when something changes in the texture of the air. I've heard what's being said in this town, he said, about Miss Bennett, about her being at Barrow Creek, and about why I've been out that way. He paused. I'm not going to tell anyone what to think, but I'm going to tell you what I know. The woman from the hotel front room had gone very still. I know that this woman has been cooking for working men in this territory for years, he said. I know she does it well, and she does it without asking for recognition, which is more than I can say for plenty of people in this town who ask for recognition without doing much at all. He kept his voice level, factual, not unkind, but with the particular weight of a man who has made a decision and is not going to be talked back from it. I know that the most valuable thing I have encountered in the Montana Territory in the past several years is not 12,000 acres of grassland. It is the company of a woman who is honest with me when most people aren't, and who has more self-possession than anyone I've had the privilege of knowing. And I know that whatever conclusions this town has drawn about what that means, or what she is, or what she's after, those conclusions say more about the people who drew them than they do about her. He stopped. The street was quiet enough that the distant sound of a horse at the far end of the block was clearly audible. Then he turned to Clara. She was looking at him with an expression she couldn't entirely control, something between shaken and something that didn't have a name in any language she'd learned. She had expected words, maybe. She had not expected those words spoken in that way, with that particular absence of hesitation. "I'm sorry," he said, and this was only for her, lower than the street-facing speech. "I should have said something months ago." She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could exactly, and she wasn't going to say something inadequate just to fill the silence. Around them, the Sunday morning street had returned to its ordinary business, or was making a pretense of doing so, because several people were quite evidently still watching while pretending not to. The woman from the hotel front room had disappeared. They did ride back to Barrow Creek on his horses, as it turned out. They rode mostly in silence, which was the kind of silence that had been earned by a morning that had required considerable talking. The road north was familiar to Clara now, in the way that roads become familiar over a year. Every turn and grade and section where the cottonwoods came close to the track. She knew this road. It was, in whatever incomplete way, something like her road. Colton rode beside her at a distance that was proper and didn't require negotiation. Occasionally he said something about the country they were passing through, and she responded, and then they went back to the silence that was not uncomfortable. She thought about what he'd said on the main street. She tried to find something wrong with it, tried to locate the vanity or the calculation or the performance in it, because in her experience most things that looked selfless had something else underneath. She couldn't find it. He had said what he'd said because the alternative was standing by while something unjust continued, and he was a man who, it turned out, could not do that and live comfortably with himself afterward. She found she respected that more than she would have found it comfortable to say out loud. "The women who were talking," she said, when they were about 4 miles from the ranch. "You'll see them again, at the cattlemen's supper or wherever else." "I imagine so," he said. "It won't be comfortable." "No," he agreed. "Does that bother you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Less than the alternative," he said. They rode on. The ranch came into sight as the afternoon was reaching its warmest point, the low buildings visible across the flat pasture land, the cottonwoods along the creek making their particular summer sound. Clara felt something ease in her chest at the sight of it. Not happiness exactly, not relief, just the particular settling that happens when you return to a place that has, without your entirely deciding it, become the place you're returning to. She put her horse in the near corral and went to the kitchen. The stove was cold. The room had the particular stillness of a space that has been unused for a day, a held quality, as if it was waiting. She got the fire going, and the stove began ticking as it warmed, and the kitchen started to smell like itself again. She was going to start the evening's bread when she heard Ira in the yard calling something to Cal, and Cal responding, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch reassembling around her. And she stood at the work table with the flour sack in her hands and thought about a man standing on a Sunday morning street saying the most valuable thing I have encountered in the Montana Territory. She set the flour sack down. She did something she hadn't done in the middle of an afternoon in a very long time. She opened the journal. It was in her bag, which she hadn't yet taken to her room, and she wrote. Not a song, just what she was thinking. The words came out in a rush that surprised her, unguarded and a little clumsy, the way things come out when you write before you've decided what you're going to say. She wrote 2 pages without stopping and then read them back, and they were raw and true, and nothing she'd ever read aloud to anyone, and she put the journal in her bag and started the bread. That night the kitchen was hers. The stove was fully warm and the bread was cooling and the supper things were done. and she opened the window to let in the June evening and stood at the work table with the journal and wrote the rest of the song she'd been circling for months, the one that was partly borrowed and partly entirely her own, and sang it softly while she wrote, working out the places where the melody didn't quite fit the words and adjusting until it settled. She was nearly done when she heard the sound from the far end of the ranch, a sharp, wrong sound, something between a crack and a roar, and looked up to see, through the window, a glow of orange light that had no business being where it was. Her first thought, absurdly, was that someone had left a lantern in the wrong place. Her second thought was that the glow was coming from the direction of the breezeway, and then the smell hit her. Not the comfortable, ordinary smell of the stove fire she'd been tending all evening, but something acrid and total, the smell of wood burning that isn't supposed to be burning. And she looked down and saw the thin line of smoke already threading under the kitchen door. She had time to grab the journal from the work table before the smoke thickened, and then the ceiling above the breezeway door shuddered with a sound like something giving way, and the smoke came in fast and low, and the room changed around her in the way that rooms change when fire stops being contained and becomes the thing in charge. She moved toward the window. She was fast. She'd always been fast, practical, the kind of person who doesn't hesitate when something needs doing. She was halfway to the window when a beam from the ceiling gave up its argument with the heat and came down across the left side of the room, and the impact shook the floor hard enough that she lost her footing and went down. And the smoke was serious now, the kind that takes your lungs and replaces what was in them with something that doesn't work. And she had the journal still in her hand, and she was trying to get up and couldn't quite. And the window was still there, still lit by the orange outside, 8 feet away and getting harder to see. She heard her name. She heard it through the smoke and the roaring and the way that fire has of filling every frequency of sound with itself once it gets large enough. She heard it clearly, the way you sometimes hear your own name through impossible noise, because there's something in the ear that's tuned for it. And then the window broke inward. Not the smoke, something deliberate, something intentional. And cold night air came rushing in, and with it a hand, an arm, and the voice again, close now, urgent without being panicked, saying, "Clara, here. Come here." She moved toward the voice. Outside, the ranch had come alive with shouting and running feet and the sound of the horses in the near pasture responding to the fire with the particular terrified energy of animals that understand what fire means. The orange light was everywhere now, casting everything in the unsteady, horrible warmth of something being consumed. But the window was there, and Colton Ashford was at the window, one arm through the broken glass without appearing to notice what the glass was doing to it, and his hand found her arm, and she grabbed it, and he pulled. She came through the window and onto the ground outside, and the cold June air hit her like something physical. A wall of clean, dark, breathable night that her lungs seized on with an urgency she hadn't known she was capable of. She was coughing, and her eyes were streaming, and the journal was still in her hand, which was a thing she noticed with the particular, ridiculous clarity of a mind trying to make sense of what it's experiencing. Colton was beside her. He was saying something, but she couldn't quite track it yet. His right arm had blood on it from the window glass. He didn't seem to be paying attention to that. Around them, the ranch was organizing itself in the chaotic way of emergencies. Men with buckets, men with the pump, voices calling back and forth in the dark. The breezeway was fully involved. The kitchen was losing its roof. Clara sat on the cold ground with the journal in her hands and her breath slowly coming back, and she looked at the burning kitchen, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "I'm not gone. I'm right here." Everything that came next, the pain in her lungs, the hours before the fire was fully out, the people who came in the night to help fight it, the shock that settled over her like a cold cloth in the small hours, all of that was coming. She knew it was coming. But in that first moment, on the ground, with the cold air in her lungs and the orange light on everything, she understood something about herself that she hadn't fully known before. She was not the kind of person who disappeared. The doctor came from Mineral Falls before sunrise. His name was Ira Voss, not the young hand, a different Ira entirely. A man in his late 50s with a gray beard and the unhurried competence of someone who had been making pre-dawn house calls in the Montana Territory for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by the circumstances he arrived to find. He examined Clara in the side quarters room where the hands had carried her after pulling her away from the kitchen area, and he told Colton and Douglas Pruitt, who were both standing in the doorway, that her lungs had taken in more smoke than was ideal, but that she was young and otherwise healthy, and what she needed most was rest and clean air and someone to make sure she was drinking enough water. "Nothing broken?" Colton asked. "Her wrist is sprained from the fall," Voss said. "Wrap it and keep it still for 2 weeks. Her eyes will be irritated for several days. That's normal. The coughing will be worse before it's better." He paused, closing his bag. She was lucky. 10 more minutes in that room and we'd be having a different conversation. He left at first light. Colton didn't leave. Pruitt came by at 7 in the morning with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who understood that the situation had moved substantially outside the ordinary parameters of his management responsibilities. "I've got men assessing the damage," he said to Colton in the yard outside the side quarters. "Breezeway is gone. Kitchens? It's bad. The main house held. The wind was right." "I know," Colton said. "We'll need to talk about rebuilding," Pruitt said. "We will. Not today." Pruitt looked at the side quarters door, then back at Colton. He seemed to want to say something else and thought better of it. He put his hat back on and went to manage his men. Clara woke at mid-morning to find a glass of water on the table beside the bed, and Colton sitting in the chair near the window with a book open in his lap that he was not reading. His right arm was bandaged from wrist to elbow. She'd seen the cuts from the window glass in the chaos of the night before, but hadn't had the capacity to address it then. "You're still here," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, a scraped, smoky quality that didn't sound like her. "I'm still here," he confirmed. She reached for the water. Her sprained wrist made her clumsy about it, and she almost knocked it over, and his hand came out to steady the glass without making anything of the gesture, just a natural correction. "How bad is the kitchen?" she asked. He didn't soften it. "The breezeway and kitchen are gone. The main house structure held." She absorbed this. She thought about the long wooden work table, the iron hooks on the wall, the window that had let in the morning light at that particular angle, the cast iron stove that had been there long enough to have its own settled relationship with the floor beneath it, the cracked plaster above it that she'd looked at every morning while the coffee brewed. "The journal," she said. "You had it when I got to you," he said. She looked at her hands. She had no memory of holding on to it through all of it, but apparently she had. "The rolling pin," she said, which was an odd thing to think about, she knew, but the rolling pin had been a gift, and gifts had a different weight than things you'd simply acquired. "Clara," he said quietly. "I know," she said. I know what it is." She took a breath, which produced a cough she didn't entirely manage to suppress. When it passed, she said, "What started it?" "Lantern in the breezeway. One of the new hands, the ones Pruitt hired in April, left it too close to the wall bracket. The bracket was dry rot." He paused. "It wasn't deliberate, just carelessness." "Is the hand—" "He's fine. He was in the bunkhouse." A pause. "He's aware of what he did." Clara set the water glass down. Outside the window, the morning was fully established. Blue sky, high summer light, the sounds of the ranch in its working hours. It felt strange to be in bed while all of that was happening. "I should get up," she said. "Voss said rest." "Voss doesn't have a ranch to feed." "Pruitt has someone handling the meals today," Colton said. "It's managed." She looked at him. He was watching her with the careful attention he'd had all morning, not hovering, not panicked, just consistently present in the way of a man who had decided where he was going to be and was not going to be talked out of it. The bandage on his arm was white against his tanned skin, and she thought about him at the kitchen window with his arm through the broken glass. "Your arm," she said. "It's fine." "Let me see." "Clara, let me see it," she said. He extended his arm without further argument. She unwrapped the top portion of the bandage. Her sprained wrist made it awkward and took longer than it should have, and looked at the cuts. They were not minor. 3 of them were deep enough to have needed stitching, which Voss had apparently done, and the surrounding skin had the bruised look of cuts that had bled seriously before being addressed. She rewrapped the bandage. She didn't say anything for a moment. "You broke the window," she said. "It was the fastest way in." "With your arm." "It was the fastest way in," he said again. Not defensive, just factual. She looked at the bandage. She thought about the moment when she'd heard her name through the smoke and the roaring, and the way it had cut through everything else with a clarity that had nothing to do with volume. She thought about what it meant that a man had heard her name through that sound and gone toward it instead of away from it. "Thank you," she said. It came out smaller than she intended. Not inadequate exactly, just plain, the way real thanks sometimes is when it's too large for formal words. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his face settled in a way she'd seen before. On the ridge above the ranch, in the kitchen doorway on winter mornings, in a dozen small moments over the past 8 months that she had registered and set aside, and was now, in this plain morning light, no longer able to set aside. She lay back against the pillow and closed her eyes and let the room be quiet around her, and after a while she heard him turn a page in the book he was not reading, and the morning moved on. She was on her feet by Wednesday. Not at full capacity. The cough lingered for 10 days, and her wrist ached with a dull persistence that she managed by simply not using it more than necessary, which was a significant inconvenience in a profession that required both hands. But she was upright and functional, and the particular restlessness of a working person confined to bed had become too insistent to ignore. Pruitt had set up a temporary cooking arrangement in the main house kitchen, which was smaller but intact, and a woman from a neighboring farm had come in to help manage meals for the hands while Clara recovered. Clara went in on Wednesday morning and stood at the door of this improvised arrangement and took quiet stock of it, and then went and found Pruitt. "I can take the midday meal," she said. "Voss said 2 weeks," Pruitt said. "Voss said my wrist needs 2 weeks," she said. "My wrist doesn't do the thinking. I can manage light cooking." Pruitt looked at her. He had the expression he used when he'd already lost an argument but hadn't yet officially conceded it. "Light," he said. "Light," she agreed. She was back in a kitchen by Wednesday noon. The main house kitchen was cramped and had a stove that ran hot on the left side, and the pots were organized by someone who had a different system than hers, but she worked with what was there. It was imperfect and occasionally frustrating, and she burned the underside of the cornbread because of the uneven stove, and she was genuinely tired by the end of it, in a way that she wasn't used to being tired. But the kitchen was a kitchen, and the work was the work. And something in her that had been held at an odd angle since Sunday night eased back into its ordinary position. Colton came back on Thursday. He'd been back and forth 3 times since Sunday. He had his own ranch to run and couldn't live indefinitely at Barrow Creek, and Clara had told him so clearly on Tuesday when she'd caught him still in the yard at 4 in the afternoon with no apparent plans to leave. He'd gone. He'd come back Thursday morning with a man she didn't know and took Pruitt out to look at the burned kitchen in Breezeway. She watched them from the main house kitchen window while she was making bread. Colton and Pruitt, and the unfamiliar man walking the perimeter of the damage, pointing at things, crouching to look at the foundation, measuring things with a tape that the third man produced from his coat pocket. Cal came into the kitchen mid-morning for coffee and stood beside her for a moment looking out the same window. "Architect," he said, nodding toward the unfamiliar man. Clara looked at him. "From Helena, I'd guess. I've seen that coat before." He poured his coffee. "Expensive coat." "What would he need an architect for?" Clara asked. Cal looked at her with the mild patience of a man waiting for a slightly slow student to arrive at an obvious answer. He drank his coffee and went back to work. Colton came to the main house kitchen that afternoon while she was cleaning up from the midday meal. He had his hat in his hands and the particular manner he had when he was going to say something he'd thought about. She handed him a cup of coffee without being asked. "Thank you," he said. She went back to wiping down the stove surface. "Who's the man with you?" "His name is Edward Cross. He's a builder." She kept wiping. "What are you building?" "I want to talk to you about that." She stopped wiping. She turned around and leaned back against the stove with her arms crossed and looked at him. "The kitchen and breezeway need to be rebuilt," he said. "There's no argument about that. But the structure that was there was 30 years old, and it was—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "Adequate. It did what it needed to do." "It did," she said. "I'd like to do something different," he said. She waited. He set his coffee cup on the table and reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and set it on the table, smoothing it with one hand, and she came and looked at it. It was a sketch, not architectural drawings, not the precise technical kind, but a clear, considered pencil sketch of a building done by someone who understood space and proportion. It showed a larger structure than the old kitchen, with what appeared to be a proper dining room attached, and a front facing the road rather than the yard, and windows. More windows than the old kitchen had ever had. Tall ones that would let in morning light from the east. There was a sign sketched above the door. She leaned in and read it. The Hearth Song. She straightened up. "I don't understand," she said. "I'd like to build a proper eating establishment," he said. "Not a ranch kitchen. Something that can serve the public, travelers, families, ranch hands, whoever comes through." He paused. "This part of the territory doesn't have anything like it. The nearest proper restaurant is in Mineral Falls, and it's not good." She looked at the sketch again. "This is on Barrow Creek land. I've spoken to the owner about purchasing the front section," he said. "He's willing." "You'd own the building," she said. "The building, yes. I'd pay to construct it." "And you'd employ me to run the kitchen," she said. She kept her voice neutral because she wanted to understand the arrangement before she decided how she felt about it. "No," he said. She looked at him. "I'd build it," he said. "You'd own it. The operation, the name, what's served, how it's run, that's yours." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not a sensible business arrangement," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. Why would you build something and hand it to someone else to own?" He picked up his coffee cup again. He looked at the sketch on the table. "Because the building is the easy part," he said. "I can pay for wood and glass and stone. I can hire Cross to design it and his crew to build it. That's just money." He paused. "But a place that people want to come back to, that has nothing to do with money. That's something you make." He looked at her. "I can't make what you make. I can make the room where it happens." She looked at the sketch for a long time. The name above the door, the tall east windows. The dining room attached, big enough for, she counted the tables sketched in, maybe 30 people. "This is too much," she said. "It's not," he said. "Colton, it's not," he said again, steadily. "I've built 12,000 acres of cattle operation in this territory, and I will tell you plainly that I have never built anything that I believed mattered to people the way a meal, made by someone who gives a damn about what they're cooking, matters. And I would like to put something into the world that isn't just about land and cattle and money." He stopped. "I'm not saying that well." "You're saying it fine," she said, which was what she always said when he was saying something true in the plain, unadorned way he had. She picked up the sketch and held it. The paper was good quality. He'd had it done properly, not just a quick pencil gesture, but something thought through. The windows were exactly where windows should be if you were thinking about morning light in an eastern-facing kitchen. Whoever had drawn this had talked to someone who understood kitchens. "Did you tell Cross what the kitchen needed?" she asked. "I told him what I'd observed," he said. "He may have gotten some things wrong." "The window height is right," she said. "On the east side." "Good," he said quietly. She set the sketch down. She looked at the name again, the Hearth Song. "You can't name it that," she said. "Why not?" "Because the whole territory will know where it came from," she said. "And people will talk. People will talk regardless," he said. "I think we've established that." She looked at him. He was watching her with that expression that had become familiar over 8 months, the one that didn't demand anything from her, that was simply present, that was willing to wait as long as the waiting took. He was not a patient man by nature, she'd come to understand. He had the restlessness of someone whose mind moved fast and who struggled with things that moved slowly. But with her he was patient. She didn't know entirely what to make of that, except that it was real. And real things deserved to be looked at clearly. "You'd have no authority over the menu," she said. "None," he agreed. "Or the hours?" "None." "Or who I hire, when I hire?" "No." She looked at the sketch one more time. Then she folded it carefully, the way it had been folded, and held it. "I need to think about it," she said. "I know," he said. "Give me a week." "Take 2, he said. She handed him back the sketch. He took it but didn't put it away immediately. Just held it for a moment between them. "Clara," he said. Just her name, nothing attached to it. "I know," she said. She didn't know entirely. What she was saying she knew. But it felt true when she said it, and he seemed to understand it, and the kitchen was quiet around them with the afternoon light coming through the main house windows at the wrong angle for a kitchen she'd been tolerating for 4 days and missing the right one without quite admitting it. He left a half hour later. She watched him ride north with the architect, who was going back to Helena to finalize his drawings, and she stood at the wrong-angled window and held the thought that was asking to be thought. She did not think it yet. She let it sit, the way you sometimes have to let things sit before you know the real shape of them. The 2 weeks she'd asked for became 10 days. She told herself she needed time to think clearly about the arrangement, which was true. She also needed time to understand what accepting it would mean, not just practically, but in terms of everything that had been accumulating since a November evening when a man had heard her singing through a kitchen window and left an anonymous note on the sill. She'd been careful for so long. Careful was the thing that had kept her employed and housed and out of situations that ended badly, and she had good reasons for careful that went back further than this ranch and this particular year. But careful and honest weren't always the same thing. And she'd been raised to value honesty above most other things, and the honest truth was that she already knew what her answer was. She'd known it when she'd seen the east-facing windows in the sketch. She'd known it before that, on the ridge above the Ashford land, when he'd said, "I don't have a place on it that feels like home," and she'd felt something rearrange itself inside her that she hadn't had the courage to name at the time. On the 10th day, she sent a message with the supply wagon asking Colton to come to Barrow Creek when he had time, and he came the next afternoon. She was in the main house kitchen when he arrived. She'd made coffee, which she did not ordinarily do in the middle of the afternoon, and she'd put out the 2 cups she used for company, even though the main house kitchen was not her space and the cups were not hers. Small things, they mattered. "I'll do it," she said when he was in the doorway. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure of anything," she said, which was honest. "But yes." He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. She poured the coffee. They sat across from each other the way they'd been sitting across from each other, one way or another, for the better part of a year. "I have conditions," she said. "I'd expect nothing less," he said. She'd written them down in the journal, which she'd thought about but decided was appropriate. There was something right about the conditions being in the same book as the songs. She read them from memory because she'd gone over them enough times to have them steady. The menu was entirely her decision. She would hire her own staff, and she would pay them fairly from the operating revenue, and the pay structure was her business. She would set the hours and the prices. If at any point she wanted to close the Hearth Song or sell the establishment, that was her right without negotiation or explanation required. And one more thing, the sign above the door would say, "The Hearth Song, Clara Bennett, proprietor." Not because she needed the credit, because she'd spent enough of her life being useful to people without her name attached to the work, and she was not going to do that again. "Done," he said for each of them. He didn't haggle, he didn't modify. He said done each time with the straightforwardness of a man who had come to the table having already thought through what he was agreeing to. "You should write this down," she said. "A proper agreement." "I'll have my lawyer draft something this week," he said. "You can have someone review it before you sign." She nodded. They drank the coffee. Outside the window, the July afternoon was settling toward evening, the light going that particular warm, low-angled gold of long summer days in the territory. Somewhere across the yard, Cal was talking to one of the newer hands in the unhurried, instructional tone she'd come to associate with him. "The name," Colton said after a while. "What about it?" "You didn't object to it." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Her wrist was mostly healed now, just a residual ache when the weather changed. "No," she said. "You said people would talk." "I said that," she agreed. "But you didn't say change it." She looked at the coffee cup. "No," she said. "I didn't say change it." He was quiet. Then, "Why not?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the song that had been half finished in the journal on the night of the fire, and the way she'd written it down in the side quarters room during her recovery. The full version finally, the one that had been circling for months. She thought about the name of the place where that song had come from. Not a specific building, not a specific kitchen, but something more internal than that. Some location inside the work of an ordinary day that was also the location of everything she cared most about. "Because it's accurate," she said finally. He looked at her. "A hearth is just a fire in a useful place," she said. "And a song is..." It's just a true thing in sound. She stopped. That's all I've ever tried to make in a kitchen, something true and useful. The name fits. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I think that's the best explanation of either word I've ever heard. It'll probably still make people talk, she said. Probably, he said. I don't care as much as I used to, she said, and she found, as she said it, that it was true. Construction began in the second week of August. Edward Cross came down from Helena with 4 men and a wagon full of materials, and the cleared land where the old kitchen and breezeway had stood became a construction site that was considerably more ambitious than anything that had been there before. The foundation was laid in the first week. Good stone, mortared properly, deeper than the old structure had been. The framing went up in the third week of August with a speed that impressed even Cal, who watched from a careful distance and said very little, which was his version of approval. Clara watched the framing go up from the window of the main house kitchen where she was still cooking. She'd settled into the cramped space, had reorganized it to her own system, had fixed the problem with the left-running stove by adjusting the flue, and something happened in her chest that she didn't entirely have words for. It wasn't just excitement. It wasn't just gratitude, though there was gratitude in it. It was more like watching something that had lived only inside her head, a version of a place she'd been building in imagination without knowing she was doing it, start to exist in the actual world, with weight and dimension and wood you could put your hand on. She went out one evening in the third week of August, when the crew had packed up for the day and the framing was standing alone in the late light. She walked through the open spaces where the walls would be, her boots on the raw subflooring, and she stood where she calculated the work table would go. The east windows were framed in. The evening light came through them at exactly the angle she'd hoped. She stood there for a while by herself with her hands at her sides and the crickets starting up in the grass beyond the construction, and she didn't try to name what she was feeling because some things are complete without names. September came, and with it the first cool evenings, and the early dark and the particular quality of light that October approaches. The building was enclosed by mid-September, the roof on and the windows glazed and the interior beginning to take shape. Cross was a careful builder. Slower than a careless one, but the work was solid, fitted where it needed to be fitted. The stove installation in particular done with an attention to the flue system that the old kitchen had never had. Clara was in the building every day by the second week of September. She consulted with Cross on the kitchen layout with the specificity of someone who had spent years understanding what she needed and hadn't had a kitchen that provided it. The placement of the dry storage, the depth of the stone sinks, the iron hooks, this time on 2 walls, not 1. The window above the left-hand sink in exactly the position it had been in the old kitchen, because some things you keep. Colton came frequently but not daily. He looked at the progress, talked to Cross, and came to find Clara wherever she was in the building. These conversations were the practical kind. The kitchen layout, the dining room table configuration, what she'd need in terms of initial equipment and supplies. He was good at the practical conversations, and she understood that this was how he expressed what he wasn't saying in other ways, by being useful. But there were other conversations too. On a Thursday in late September, when the dining room floor was being laid and the sound of hammering filled the new space, they stood together at the east windows of the kitchen looking out at the creek bottom and the cottonwoods going yellow with the first real autumn color, and he said without particular preamble, "I've been thinking about the land deal with Pruett. You're not buying the section?" she asked. "I'm buying a different section," he said. She looked at him. "The section the building is on," he said, "and the land adjacent. I've made an offer on the full front parcel." She understood what that meant. If the land under the hearth song was Ashford land and the building was in her name, she would be a tenant of sorts on land she didn't own. She'd thought about this and set it aside, but here it was. "That makes me uncomfortable," she said directly. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you instead of just doing it." She thought about it. "Is there a version of this where the land under the building is mine?" "Yes," he said. "The parcel the building sits on. I'll have the lawyer draft it as a separate conveyance, included with the building." She looked at him. "That's a significant—" "Clara," he said, "I have 12,000 acres. The front parcel of Barrow Creek is 120. I don't need it." "That's not the point," she said. "I know it's not the point." He looked out the window at the yellowing cottonwoods. The point is that I don't want you to feel like you're standing on ground that could be moved under you. I want you standing on your own ground. He paused. That matters to me. She was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, she said. All right, he said. They stood at the window for a while after that, watching the cottonwood leaves come loose in the September wind and drop toward the creek, one at a time, unhurried. The Hearth Song opened on the first Saturday of October. It opened quietly. No ceremony, no announcement in the territorial paper, no invited guests. Clara had decided against a formal opening on the grounds that she wasn't interested in performing a debut. She was interested in finding out whether the kitchen ran the way she'd planned it, and you couldn't learn that from a ceremony. She opened the door at 7 in the morning. She had coffee on and bread in the oven and 2 women she'd hired from Mineral Falls, a widow named Pearl, who had kitchen experience, and Pearl's niece Josephine, who had none but who was quick and eager and had the particular intelligence of someone who learns from watching, working beside her. The first customer was Cal. He came through the door at 7:10 with his hat in his hand and sat at the table nearest the east window and ordered coffee and whatever was coming out of the oven. Clara brought him the coffee herself. Well, he said, looking around the room. The morning light was coming through the east windows exactly as she'd hoped, laying long, pale strips across the new floorboards. Well, she agreed. It's good, he said. He said it the way he said most things, without excess, with the weight of a man who has seen enough things to know the difference between what's good and what just looks good. The bread isn't out yet, she said. I meant the room, he said. She went back to the kitchen. By noon, there were 11 people in the dining room. By the following Saturday, there were 23. By the end of October, the word had traveled in the particular organic way of things that don't need advertising. From a rancher who'd stopped in on his way south to a merchant who'd heard about it in Mineral Falls to a family on their way to Helena who'd taken the long road because someone had mentioned it was worth the detour. Clara cooked. Pearl managed the dining room with a quiet authority that Clara hadn't fully anticipated and appreciated enormously. Josephine burned things occasionally and apologized with a sincerity that was impossible to be impatient with, and she stopped burning things by November, which was fast enough. The journal lived on the shelf above the left-hand sink, in the position where a cookbook might have lived, and it was not a cookbook. It was the songs and the fragments, and the full version of the song that had been half finished on the night of the fire, written out in the side quarters room during recovery. Clara wrote in it in the evenings after the kitchen was cleaned, before she banked the stove for the night. Sometimes she sang while she wrote, which Pearl had heard twice and commented on 0 times, which was the correct response. She sang sometimes in the early mornings too, before the customers came, while the bread was in the oven and the kitchen was warm and the east light was coming through the windows and the room was entirely hers. She didn't think about who might hear it. She had stopped thinking about that. Colton came to the Hearth Song on a Wednesday in the second week of October. He came at mid-morning between the breakfast customers and the noon crowd, which was either coincidence or something he'd worked out to avoid the busier hours, and she suspected the latter because he was a man who thought about timing. He sat at the table by the east window, Cal's table, but Cal wasn't there, and she brought him coffee without being asked. It's working, he said, looking around the room. It's early, she said. Ask me in a year. It's working, he said again. She sat down across from him, which she didn't ordinarily do with customers, but he was not exactly a customer. The stove runs better than any I've ever worked with, she said. Cross did something right with the flue placement. I'll tell him you said so. It'll go to his head. Probably, he said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Are you happy here? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know if happy is the right word, she said. I feel like myself here. That might be better. He looked at her with the expression she'd long since stopped trying to categorize. I think it is better, he said. They sat in the October morning with the light through the east windows and the sound of the new kitchen behind her. Pearl's voice saying something to Josephine, the sound of the stove, the ordinary sounds of a place running, and something that had been a long time building settled, quietly, into the shape it had been moving toward since November of the previous year, when a man on a horse had stopped in the dark outside a lit window and listened. I wrote down the rest of the song, she said. The one that was in progress when, I know, he said. I'd like you to hear it, she said. Sometime, when it's not mid-morning and there are people coming in. I'd like that, he said, quietly, without making it into anything larger than what it was, which was an invitation accepted. She took his empty cup back to the kitchen. She was halfway through the door when she stopped, which was becoming a habit between them, this stopping in doorways. "Colton," she said. He turned. "Thank you," she said. Not for the building, for the window. He understood what she meant. His arm was healed now. She could see the faint pink lines of the scars below his cuff line. And he looked at it for a moment, then back at her, and the expression on his face was something she had run out of reasons to look away from. "Any time," he said. She went back to the kitchen. Outside, October was doing what October does in the Montana Territory, pulling the warmth out of the afternoons and putting a blue edge on the mornings, turning the cottonwoods along the creek to gold, making the air smell like distance and cold water, and the particular sweetness of leaves letting go. The days were getting shorter. The stove would work harder. Clara put on her apron and checked the bread and looked out the east windows at the creek going golden under the autumn trees, and the room around her was hers. The hooks on the walls, the long work table, the stove that ran true, the window above the left-hand sink in exactly the right position, and she knew, without sentiment, without ceremony, that she was not going anywhere. This was the ground she was standing on. It was hers. The first winter of the Hearth Song was the kind of winter that tests things. November came in hard that year, harder than the previous one, which had already been unpleasant enough. The North Road drifted over twice in the first 2 weeks and had to be cleared by hand. The temperature dropped to places the thermometer outside the dining room window registered with a kind of flat, indifferent authority. The creek froze solid by the second week of November, and the cottonwoods along the bank stood bare and gray against a sky that hadn't shown blue in 10 days. Clara kept the stove burning. That was, at its most basic, what she did. Kept the fire going, kept the food coming, kept the dining room warm enough that the people who stopped in from the road could feel the cold leave their shoulders before they'd finished their first cup of coffee. The Hearth Song was not a grand establishment. It had 8 tables, a kitchen that ran exactly as she'd designed it, and 2 women who knew their work. It had no sign of elegance beyond the quality of what came out of the oven and off the stove, and no claim to anything more than that. It was by December the most reliably full room in the territory between Mineral Falls and the county seat. Travelers came because word had traveled faster than either of them had anticipated. Ranching families came on the weekends because there was nowhere else in a 50-mile radius where a family could sit at a proper table and eat something that wasn't produced by exhausted hands in an understocked kitchen. Cowboys came because Pearl ran the dining room with an equality of service that didn't make distinctions between a man in a good coat and a man in a working one. And the people of Mineral Falls came, slowly, carefully, in ones and twos, because something had shifted after the Sunday morning on the main street and the fire and the building going up. And the shift was not fully explainable, but it was real. Mrs. Hartfield did not come. Clara did not expect her to and was not troubled by the absence. The woman who had said she can barely read, I'd imagine in the hotel dining room, came in February, with her husband and a visiting sister from back east. Clara was in the kitchen, and Pearl managed their table with the same unhurried professionalism she gave everyone. The woman ate the meal, rabbit stew with rosemary biscuits and a dried apple pie that had become, without anyone planning it, the thing people mentioned when they described the Hearth Song to someone who hadn't been. And she left without incident. Pearl reported nothing significant. Clara had not expected an apology. She had not wanted one. What she had wanted, quietly, without putting the word to it, was simply to be there. To be in the kitchen, to be the Hearth Song, Clara Bennett, proprietor on the sign above the door. When those women came through it, to still be standing. That was enough. That had always been the thing she was after, if she was honest about it. Not recognition, just continuity, the right to keep going. Colton came on Wednesdays, mostly. It had become a pattern without being designated as one. The mid-morning hours, the east window table, coffee, and whatever was coming out of the oven. Sometimes he stayed for the noon meal. Sometimes he talked about the ranch, about the eastern section he'd been developing, about the ongoing business of 12,000 acres in a territory that was changing faster than anyone had predicted. Sometimes they talked about nothing in particular, or sat in a silence that had by now been thoroughly broken in, worn smooth and comfortable, a silence neither of them needed to fill. Pearl pretended not to notice that Clara sat across from him on Wednesdays, the way she didn't sit across from other customers. Josephine, who was 20 and had not yet learned the discretion of pretending not to notice things, noticed loudly and was silenced by a look from Pearl that Josephine had also not yet learned to interpret correctly. She learned, eventually. In January, when the road was drifted and the Wednesday visit wasn't possible, Clara received a letter. She had received letters from Colton before. Brief, practical notes about the legal documentation of the building and the land conveyance, the kind of correspondence that required a written record. This letter was not that. It was 2 pages, written in his careful, unhurried hand, and it said things that a man says on paper when the road is drifted and he has more time than usual to sit in his study and think about what he would say if he could. It was not flowery, it was not excessive, it was just the plain truth of what he felt, stated in the direct way he had always stated plain truths, and she read it twice at the kitchen table in the early morning before Pearl and Josephine arrived. And then she put it in the journal between 2 pages, because that was where it belonged. She wrote back. It took her 3 attempts, the first 2 careful, the second overcorrecting into something that didn't sound like her. The third was right, plain, honest, the true thing without the armor she didn't need anymore. She sent it with the supply wagon. The road cleared in February. He asked her on a Wednesday in March. He came in at the usual time, and the morning was quiet. Only 2 other customers, both finishing up, both heading out as he came in, which left the dining room to themselves by the time Pearl had refilled his coffee and gone back to the kitchen with the pointed consideration of a woman who understood the situation and respected it. He didn't make a ceremony of it. She was glad of that. A ceremony would have felt wrong, would have felt like something being performed for an audience that wasn't there, and she'd spent enough of her life performing for audiences that weren't paying attention. He said, "I'd like us to get married, if you're willing." She was holding her own coffee cup. She set it down. She looked at him across the east window table. In the morning light that came through the glass at the angle she'd specifically designed the building to accommodate, and she thought about an anonymous note on a windowsill and firewood she hadn't asked for, and a repaired hinge and tea and a painted tin, and a man standing in a kitchen doorway in the dark of early morning, holding his hat and asking if there was coffee. "I'm willing," she said. He exhaled once. "I was prepared for it to take longer," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it since January." The letter, she confirmed. He looked at her with something in his face that she'd stopped trying to categorize months ago, because it was simply his face when he was looking at her, and it didn't need a category. It just needed to be what it was. "I don't need anything from you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. The building is yours. The land is yours. "I know that," she said. "I know what you want," she said. "I want it too." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Pearl came out from the kitchen with more coffee that neither of them had asked for, looked at their faces, set the pot on the table, and went back to the kitchen without a word. From behind the closed door came a sound that might have been Josephine being hushed. Clara and Colton looked at each other, and something happened in both their faces at the same time. Reluctant, and then not reluctant. A laugh, small and genuine, the kind that comes from the actual moment rather than from politeness. It was the best version of a laugh, the kind that didn't plan itself. They married in May. No territorial paper correspondent, no Cattlemen's Club supper, no invited crowd. Pruitt came because he was Pruitt and it would have been wrong not to. Cal came because he had been watching this unfold since November of 1886 with the patience of a man who knew all along how it would end and had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. Pearl and Josephine came. Cross the Builder came because Colton had thought to invite him, and Clara had agreed it was right. A handful of ranch hands who had been at Barrow Creek long enough to feel the gravity of the occasion. It was a Wednesday morning. The hearth song was closed for the day, which Josephine had taken as a personal hardship, but which Pearl had managed with quiet authority. Afterward, they ate in the dining room. Clara had cooked it herself, which everyone had tried to argue her out of, and which she had declined to be argued out of, because cooking it herself was precisely the point. It was the best meal the room had seen, which was saying something. Cal ate everything on his plate and asked for more of the biscuits, which was his version of a wedding toast. The territorial paper did eventually run a small notice, 6 lines, in the social column. Colton Ashford, prominent ranching figure, and Miss Clara Bennett, proprietor of the Hearth Song establishment, were married in a private ceremony in May. The couple will reside at the Ashford Ranch, and the Hearth Song will continue operations under Mrs. Ashford's direction. Mrs. Hartfield read it over breakfast and said nothing. Her husband read it and said, "Good for them," and went back to his eggs, which was the most sensible thing anyone in Mineral Falls said about the matter. The Hearth Song ran through the summer and into its second autumn with the accumulating confidence of something that has found its form. Clara added a 4th table in July, which brought the total to 12 and required Pearl to hire a second girl for the busy weekend hours. She extended the morning hours in August because travelers came early and there was no reason to turn away business that presented itself. She added a board outside the door. Not a menu, she resisted the formality of a menu, but a list in chalk of what was cooking that day, which turned out to be something people stopped to read with genuine interest, standing on the road with their horses patient beside them, deciding whether what was on the board was worth coming in for. It always was. That was not arrogance. It was just accurate. The journal on the shelf above the left-hand sink was full by September of the second year. She started a second one, same plain cloth cover, this time in green. The songs were all there now. Her mother's songs, fully preserved, with the best rendering of the melody she could approximate in written description. Her own songs, the ones that had come out of the evenings alone in the kitchen, were there too, and some of them surprised her when she read them back, the way writing sometimes surprises you with what you apparently knew without knowing you knew it. She still sang in the mornings. That had never stopped, and she'd stopped being careful about who heard it. Pearl had mentioned once that a customer who'd arrived early had stood outside the door listening before coming in, not wanting to interrupt. Clara had thought about that, the idea of someone standing in the early morning on the road outside, listening to something drifting through the door of a building that smelled like coffee and fresh bread, and had decided she didn't mind it. If anything, it seemed right. The singing had always been the thing she did because it was true, and true things, it turned out, had a way of traveling further than you expected when you stopped trying to contain them. The girl came on a Thursday afternoon in October of that second year. She was maybe 10, maybe 11, the age where the difference is hard to tell from the outside. She came in with a family that was traveling through, a farming family from the look of them, road-worn and quiet in the way of people who've been moving for several days and are conserving their energy for the miles still ahead. The parents ordered coffee and the midday plate. The girl sat at the table and looked at the room with the frank assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to temper curiosity with social performance. She had a small notebook. Clara noticed it when she brought the coffee to the table. The girl had it open on the table and was writing in it with a pencil stub, and she covered it quickly when Clara set down the cups, the automatic self-consciousness of someone who's been told before that what she was doing was strange. Clara didn't say anything then. She went back to the kitchen, but she came back with the midday plates, and when she set the girl's plate down, she said, without making it a large thing, "What are you writing?" The girl looked up with the cautious expression of a child who's been caught doing something that may or may not be approved of. She looked at her mother, who gave no particular guidance either way. She looked back at Clara. "Songs," she said. "Words to songs." "Your own?" Clara asked. A pause. "I don't know. Maybe. I hear tunes sometimes, and I write down words to go with them. My brother says it's a waste of paper." Clara looked at the notebook. "Does your brother know any songs?" The girl thought about it. "Not really." "Then he's not a reliable judge of what paper is for," Clara said, and went back to the kitchen. She came back at the end of the meal when the family was collecting themselves to leave with the second journal, the green one, the one she'd started when the first was full. She held it for a moment and thought about what she was doing. Then she went to the girl's side of the table and set it down. "This is too much," the girl's mother said, looking at the journal. "It's just paper," Clara said, "and there are still blank pages in the back." She looked at the girl. "Write them down. The songs that come to you. All of them. Even the ones that aren't finished yet, especially those. They'll be different if you wait." The girl held the journal with both hands. She had the expression of someone who has been handed something they didn't know they needed until it was in their hands. Thank you, she said. Keep writing, Clara said. The family left. Clara watched them from the east window as they got back in their wagon and continued north on the road. The girl was already opening the journal before the wagon had cleared the yard. Pearl came to stand beside her at the window. After a moment, she said, "You gave her your songbook." "The back pages are blank," Clara said. "The front pages aren't," Pearl said. Clara looked at the wagon until it rounded the bend in the road and disappeared into the cottonwoods. "The songs in the front are already in my head," she said. "I don't need the paper for those anymore." Pearl looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen without comment, which was the correct response. Bob. Colton found out about the journal the following Wednesday. He'd heard about it from Josephine, who had seen the whole thing and related it to him with the narrative enthusiasm she applied to everything, which meant he got the full version, including the part where the girl had looked at the journal like she'd been given a window that had previously been a wall. This was Josephine's description, which Clara would not have used herself, but which she found, when she heard it repeated, was not entirely inaccurate. He sat at the east window table and looked at her across his coffee cup. "The second journal?" he said. "The back pages were blank," she said. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, with the particular attention of a man who is thinking something he isn't sure yet whether to say. Then he said it. "You know what you did." "I gave a child a journal," she said. "You gave her permission," he said. "Those are different things." She thought about that. She thought about November of 1886 and a folded note on a windowsill. "I heard you singing through the window this evening. I don't know the song, but I know it was something real." She thought about what that note had done, not to her voice, which had never actually stopped, but to the place in her chest where she'd been storing the voice like something she wasn't sure she had the right to. "Someone did the same for me," she said. He looked at his coffee cup. "Not exactly the same," he said. "Exactly the same," she said. He didn't argue. He wasn't wrong, and she wasn't wrong, which was the way most true things worked. They had more than one accurate account. They sat in the October morning with the light through the east windows, and the sound of Pearl in the kitchen, and the smell of the bread that was 10 minutes from being ready, and the room around them was warm and solid and entirely real, built from good stone and fitted wood, and a stubbornness on both their parts that had survived a winter's worth of gossip and a fire, and the various social mechanics of a frontier territory that had strong opinions about who was supposed to belong where. "I've been thinking about the eastern section," Colton said after a while. The conversation about the journal was done in the way that their conversations were sometimes done, completely, set aside, both of them having said what needed saying. "The grazing section?" she asked. "There's a spring up in the northeast corner," he said. "Good water protected from the north wind. I've been thinking about building something up there, a proper line camp, not just a shelter." "For winter grazing?" "For whatever it ends up being useful for," he said. He was looking out the east window at the October road, at the cottonwoods going gold along the creek. "I keep thinking about what you said on the ridge, about having a place on the land that feels like rest." She looked at him. "I think I've found a few of them," he said, still looking at the window, "since last year." "Where?" she asked. He turned from the window and looked at her across the table. He didn't answer the question directly, which was its own answer, plain enough that neither of them needed to say it aloud. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside, the October road was empty and gold-lit, and somewhere in the kitchen Josephine was saying something, and Pearl was responding with the particular tone that meant, "That is incorrect. Please try again." And the stove was doing what it always did, patient and reliable. And the bread was almost ready. "The bread will be done in a few minutes," she said. "I know," he said. "I can smell it." She got up to check it. She was halfway to the kitchen door when something made her stop. Not a sound, not anything external, just the particular quality of the moment asking to be acknowledged before it passed. She turned and looked at the room, the east windows, the 12 tables, the sign above the door that she could read reversed through the glass. The hearth song. Her name underneath it. The journal shelf above the left-hand sink, now holding only the first volume. The worn blue cloth cover. The iron hooks on 2 walls. The work table she'd designed the length of herself. The floor that had been raw subflooring last September and was now seasoned and scuffed with 6 months of people coming and going. A room that had not existed a year ago. A life that had not looked like this 2 years ago. She thought about surviving versus living, about how long she had mistaken the first for enough, and how different the second turned out to feel. Not easier. Not without friction or uncertainty or the ordinary difficulties of a day, but inhabited in a way that surviving never had been, present all the way through. She went into the kitchen and checked the bread, and it was ready, and she took it out. And it was good, the crust right, and the inside exactly the weight and texture it was supposed to be. She brought it to the table herself, and when she set it down, Colton looked at it and then at her, and something moved in his face that was quiet and uncomplicated and entirely real. "Sit down," he said. "Eat with me." She sat down. Pearl brought 2 plates without being asked, which was her way of saying she approved, and Josephine didn't say anything at all, which meant Pearl had prepared her. Outside the east windows, October was doing what it always did, pulling the warmth from the afternoons, turning the world to gold and gray, making the air smell like endings that were also beginnings, the way autumn in the Montana Territory always had. The bread was good, the coffee was hot, the room was warm. Clara Bennett, Clara Ashford. Now, though she'd kept her name on the sign because it was the name that had been doing the work, and names that work deserved to stay, sat at the east window table in the room she had built inside a building someone else had paid for, on ground that was hers, in a life she had not planned and could not have imagined from the cramped kitchen she'd occupied a year and a half ago, and she felt something she had no better word for than home. Not the home you're born into, the home you build, the kind that takes longer and costs more and holds better for having been chosen. Outside, the cottonwoods dropped their last yellow leaves one at a time into the cold creek, and the road north was empty in both directions. And somewhere up on the ridge above the Ashford land, a hawk was riding the thermals in wide, patient circles, and the territory stretched out in every direction as large and indifferent and occasionally beautiful as it had always been. But the room was warm, and the bread was right, and that in the end was enough, was more than enough, was the whole thing.